On reef flats and shallow coastal shelves, danger does not swim toward you, circle you, or rise dramatically from the depths, because it has already arrived long before your foot ever enters the water. These zones feel transitional and ordinary, places where coral gives way to sand, where waves break gently, and where people wade without ceremony while launching boats, rinsing equipment, or stepping down from shore to sea. The water is often clear and shallow enough to inspire confidence, rarely deeper than a person's knee, and the bottom appears cluttered but inert, scattered with broken coral, shells, algae, and small rocks that look sharp but lifeless. This is the environment the stonefish has mastered, not by hiding beneath something, but by becoming indistinguishable from everything, transforming itself into a piece of the seabed so complete that even trained eyes fail to register its presence until the moment of impact has already occurred. A stonefish does not look like an animal waiting to strike, because it does not wait in the way predators do, and it does not strike in the way hunters do either. Its body is squat, irregular, and asymmetrical, shaped less like a fish and more like a lump of debris shaped by currents and time. The skin is thick, loose, and textured, covered in wart-like protrusions and folds that trap sediment, algae, and fragments of shell, allowing the fish to grow a living disguise that updates continuously with its surroundings. Over days and weeks, this skin accumulates enough biological noise that the outline of the fish disappears completely, erasing the boundary between organism and environment. What remains visible is not a recognizable shape, but a suggestion of rock, a patch of algae, or a darker smudge among lighter sand, none of which triggers alarm in a human brain trained to look for motion or symmetry. The stonefish's stillness is not a passive state, but a survival strategy, reinforced by physiology and behavior working together. It is capable of remaining motionless for extraordinary lengths of time, its metabolism adapted to low energy expenditure and its coloration tuned to local conditions. Small fish and crustaceans pass close, sometimes brushing against its body, mistaking it for part of the substrate, while currents move sand across its back and shells settle into its skin. Unlike animals that rely on camouflage while remaining alert and mobile, the stonefish commits fully to immobility because movement would betray the illusion it has worked so hard to build. This strategy places it directly underfoot in the places humans consider safest, because reef flats and near-shore shallows are chosen precisely for their perceived lack of large predators. The danger emerges when contact occurs, because the stonefish is armed not with teeth or speed, but with a defensive system designed to deliver maximum consequence instantly. Along its back run a series of stout dorsal spines, rigid and needle-sharp, each connected to venom glands capable of injecting one of the most potent fish venoms known. These spines are not actively thrust into a victim, but function as spring-loaded hypodermics, activated by downward pressure. When a foot steps onto the fish, the spines puncture through skin, often penetrating footwear, and venom is forced into the wound as the spines compress against the body. The action is mechanical and unavoidable, requiring no intent or movement from the fish itself, and by the time pain registers, the venom has already been delivered deep into tissue. The pain that follows is not merely intense, but structurally overwhelming, described by survivors as immediate, consuming, and escalating, radiating outward from the site of injury and refusing to stabilize. This pain is the result of venom components that interfere with nerve signaling, disrupt cellular membranes, and trigger massive inflammatory responses, effectively hijacking the body's communication systems. The affected area swells rapidly, skin color changes, and muscle control deteriorates as the venom spreads through local tissue. In severe cases, the venom's effects extend beyond the site of injury, influencing cardiovascular function and causing systemic symptoms that include nausea, weakness, and irregular heart rhythms, demonstrating that the stonefish's defenses are designed to deter large predators, not merely inconvenience them. What makes stonefish injuries particularly dangerous is the mismatch between cause and appearance, because the wound itself often looks deceptively small, consisting of puncture marks that bleed minimally and do not immediately suggest the scale of internal damage. Beneath the surface, however, venom is inducing tissue death, impairing blood flow, and setting the stage for complications that can persist long after the initial pain subsides. In untreated or severe cases, necrosis can develop around the wound, requiring medical intervention and sometimes surgical management, while systemic effects can escalate rapidly if multiple spines are involved. The stonefish does not rely on repeated strikes or prolonged contact, because its evolutionary solution is to make the first mistake the only one that matters. The locations where these encounters occur reinforce the sense of inevitability, because stonefish thrive exactly where human activity concentrates. Reef flats are favored for wading and exploration, rock pools invite barefoot entry, and boat ramps provide shallow access points where feet step down without inspection. These environments are structurally complex, littered with objects that look similar to stonefish in both shape and texture, making visual discrimination nearly impossible in real time. Sun glare, surface ripples, and stirred sediment further degrade visibility, while familiarity breeds complacency, encouraging quick steps rather than careful scanning. In these moments, the stonefish's camouflage is not just effective, it is absolute. From an ecological perspective, the stonefish's reliance on venom as a defensive tool, rather than an offensive weapon, reflects its position within reef systems as a sedentary ambush predator that cannot afford frequent relocation. It feeds primarily on small fish that wander close enough to be inhaled by a rapid mouth expansion, similar in principle to other suction-feeding fishes, but its true evolutionary investment lies in ensuring that nothing steps on it twice. Venom allows the stonefish to maintain a fixed position in high traffic zones without fleeing or fighting, converting the seabed itself into a deterrent. This strategy works not because the fish is aggressive, but because it is integrated so completely into its environment that avoidance becomes the only safe response. The physiological design of the venom delivery system underscores this role, because the spines are positioned to contact anything pressing downward, precisely the direction of force exerted by feet. Each spine is encased in a sheath of skin that retracts upon pressure, exposing the spine tip and opening channels through which venom flows. This mechanism ensures that the act of stepping provides both the trigger and the force necessary for injection, eliminating reliance on timing or active response. It is an elegant and ruthless solution to a problem faced by an animal that cannot move quickly, cannot flee easily, and cannot risk injury in a habitat full of trampling forces. When discussing survival and response, the reality of stonefish envenomation becomes starkly practical, because immediate actions can influence outcomes significantly. Hot water immersion is a first aid measure rooted in chemistry rather than folklore, as the venom proteins are heat sensitive and begin to denature at temperatures that the human body can tolerate, but venom molecules cannot. Immersing the affected area in hot water, as hot as can be endured without causing burns, can reduce pain by deactivating venom components and limiting further tissue damage. This intervention does not neutralize all effects, but it can transform an otherwise unbearable experience into one that remains manageable until medical care is reached. Antivenom represents the next level of response, providing antibodies that bind venom components and reduce their impact on the body. Access to antivenom varies by region, and its administration requires medical oversight, but when available, it can dramatically reduce symptom severity and recovery time. The existence of antivenom underscores the seriousness of stonefish encounters, because few marine animals warrant such targeted treatment. Even with prompt care, recovery can be prolonged, involving swelling, weakness, and sensitivity that persist for weeks, reinforcing the reality that the stonefish's defense is not merely painful, but profoundly disruptive. The stonefish's presence also reveals a broader truth about shallow marine ecosystems, which is that danger often aligns with stillness rather than motion. Reef flats are biologically dense zones where many organisms rely on camouflage and immobility rather than pursuit, creating an environment where hazards are defined by contact rather than proximity. Humans, accustomed to evaluating risk based on movement and size, struggle in these settings because the most dangerous animals do not behave in ways that trigger instinctive avoidance. The stonefish exploits this cognitive gap perfectly, not through deception, but through congruence, becoming exactly what the environment already looks like. Understanding the stonefish requires abandoning the idea that safety correlates with shallowness, because depth does not determine danger in reef systems, and in many cases, the opposite is true. Deeper water encourages buoyancy and distance, while shallow water encourages contact, weight-bearing, and distraction. It is in these moments of casual entry, when attention is divided and urgency is low, that the stonefish exerts its influence, transforming a routine step into a medical emergency with consequences that ripple far beyond the initial moment. The irony of the stonefish is that it is not a predator of humans, nor does it benefit from injuring large animals, yet its survival strategy is so effective that it creates some of the most severe human encounters in marine environments. It does not chase, bite, or pursue, and it does not rely on speed or aggression, but instead enforces a rule written into the fabric of the reef, which is that the bottom is alive, defended, and unforgiving of carelessness. The stonefish embodies this rule completely, turning the act of stepping into a negotiation with venom and consequence. By anchoring this chapter in the stonefish, the reef is revealed not as a passive surface, but as a living field of hidden mechanisms, each evolved to respond decisively to pressure and intrusion. The algae-coated lump beside a boat ramp, the shell-strewn patch in a rock pool, the dark shape on a reef flat are no longer neutral features, but potential points of contact loaded with biological response. In this context, awareness becomes the only reliable defense, and caution becomes an ecological skill rather than a behavioral preference. In the end, the stonefish represents the ultimate wrong step, not because it is uniquely malicious or aggressive, but because it has perfected a form of defense that activates only when human assumptions fail. The venom does not chase, the spines do not reach, and the fish does not move, yet the consequences are immediate, severe, and unforgettable. On reef flats and shallow shores, where water meets land and routine meets risk, the stonefish waits as it always has, indistinguishable from the ground itself. A reminder that in the ocean, the most dangerous encounters often begin not with movement, but with stillness beneath your feet. At docks, piers, and mooring points where the ocean meets human infrastructure, the water feels temporarily domesticated, constrained by pilings, ropes, ladders, and shadows cast by wood and steel. These are entry points rather than destinations, places where snorkelers pause, divers descend, and swimmers linger while adjusting masks or waiting their turn to climb out. The environment seems controlled and predictable because the boundaries are visible and the depth drops away gradually beneath familiar shapes. Yet this sense of order is precisely what attracts lionfish. They hover confidently in these artificial corridors, suspended beside ladder rungs, tucked against pier posts, and drifting along vertical walls where light fades into blue, positioning themselves exactly where human hands, forearms, and bare feet pass within centimeters. Lionfish do not dart or flee when approached because their evolutionary strategy does not rely on avoidance or speed. Their bodies are laterally compressed and adorned with long, radiating fin rays that expand their apparent size and create a living barrier around the fish, transforming open water into a zone of controlled distance. These fins move slowly, almost lazily, giving the impression of calm indifference, and their patterned bands blend surprisingly well against the alternating shadows cast by dock structures and wreckage. In the vertical environment of a pier or ladder, where surfaces rise straight up and down, lionfish appear almost sculptural, hovering in place as though attached to the structure rather than swimming freely. This behavior is not accidental, but the result of an animal perfectly adapted to exploit edges and transitions, using confidence and stillness as tools rather than displays of dominance. Lionfish evolved in reef systems where complex structure creates abundant ambush opportunities, and vertical surfaces allow them to corner prey against walls and overhangs. By positioning themselves near pilings, ropes, and wrecks, they recreate the geometry of their native habitats, transforming human-made features into functional hunting grounds. Small fish congregate around these structures for shelter, and the lionfish uses its expansive fins to herd prey inward, reducing escape routes until a rapid suction strike ends the encounter. For humans, the danger does not come from being targeted as prey, but from misinterpreting the lionfish's posture and pace as harmlessness. A fish that does not flee appears docile, and a fish that moves slowly seems easy to avoid. But this assumption fails in environments where movement is restricted and attention is divided. Dock ladders force bodies into narrow channels, ropes dictate hand placement, and buoyancy shifts unpredictably as waves lift and drop swimmers. In these moments, people rely on touch rather than sight, grabbing metal rungs or lines without scanning the space immediately around them. And it is here that the lionfish's defense becomes relevant. Every prominent fin ray on a lionfish is a venomous spine, connected to venom glands that run along grooves in the spine's surface. These spines are not barbed or designed to lodge deeply, but they are sharp enough to penetrate skin easily, especially when pressure is applied through accidental contact. A forearm brushing against a dorsal spine, a hand sliding past a pectoral ray, or a foot drifting into the fish while climbing can all result in envenomation, even if the contact lasts only a fraction of a second. The fish does not need to strike or react, because the act of brushing past supplies all the force required to drive the spine into tissue. The venom delivered by lionfish spines is not among the most lethal in the ocean, but it is intensely painful and physiologically disruptive, designed to deter predators immediately rather than incapacitate prey. Once injected, venom components trigger a cascade of nerve stimulation and inflammatory response, causing burning pain that radiates outward from the wound and escalates rapidly. Swelling follows, often severe enough to restrict movement in fingers, wrists, or ankles, and the affected area becomes exquisitely sensitive to pressure and temperature. This pain can persist for hours, sometimes longer, interfering with mobility and turning a simple exit from the water into a prolonged ordeal. The reason these injuries feel so disproportionate to the initial contact lies in the venom's function as a defensive signal, rather than a hunting tool. Lionfish venom is formulated to create immediate negative reinforcement, teaching predators through pain rather than paralysis, and this translates into human experiences marked by intensity rather than subtlety. Unlike bites or stings that concentrate damage at a single point, lionfish envenomation spreads through surrounding tissue, amplifying discomfort and prolonging recovery. Even minor contact can result in pain that peaks well after the incident, catching victims off guard and reinforcing the fish's reputation long after the visible injury fades. The setting amplifies the impact of these encounters, because docks and ladders are places where people are vulnerable, partially supported by structures rather than buoyancy, and unable to retreat smoothly. A sudden surge of pain while climbing out of the water can cause loss of grip, slips or falls, compounding the initial injury with secondary trauma. In crowded snorkeling areas, this risk increases as multiple people share limited space, creating unpredictable movement and reducing the ability to maintain distance from hovering fish. The lionfish's preference for these same structures ensures that overlap is frequent, especially in regions where the species has become abundant. From an ecological perspective, lionfish occupy a controversial role in many of the environments where these encounters occur, because in numerous regions they are invasive, spreading rapidly and altering local food webs. Their ability to thrive around artificial structures gives them an advantage in coastal areas, heavily modified by humans, allowing them to expand into habitats where native predators and competitors are absent or reduced. This success is partly due to their venomous defenses, which deter unfamiliar predators and allow lionfish to hunt openly without fear of retaliation. Their confidence around docks and wrecks reflects this lack of predation pressure, reinforcing behaviors that bring them into close proximity with people. The slow, hovering movement that tempts curiosity is also a product of their hunting strategy, which favors precision over speed. Lionfish approach prey deliberately, using their fins to create a visual and physical barrier that disorients smaller fish, guiding them toward the mouth with subtle adjustments rather than frantic pursuit. This method requires patience and control, traits that translate into a calm demeanor even in the presence of large animals. When humans approach, the lionfish does not flee because it does not recognize us as predators worth avoiding, and its spines provide sufficient deterrence against accidental contact. The irony of lionfish injuries lies in how easily they could be avoided with awareness, because the fish advertises its danger openly through its spines, yet familiarity dulls caution. Bright patterns and dramatic fins become aesthetic features rather than warning signals, especially for snorkelers accustomed to seeing lionfish as photographic subjects rather than hazards. This shift in perception encourages closer approaches, slower reactions, and relaxed posture near structures where contact is most likely. The result is a series of minor but memorable injuries that accumulate into a reputation for the species as a dockside menace rather than an open water threat. Understanding lionfish behavior in these contexts requires recognizing how artificial environments reshape interactions between humans and wildlife, concentrating both into narrow zones where overlap becomes unavoidable. Docks, ladders, and mooring lines are magnets for marine life, offering shade, structure, and food, and lionfish exploit these features with the same efficiency they apply to natural reefs. Their presence is not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of ecological opportunity, one that carries consequences when human routines intersect with defensive adaptations evolved for entirely different encounters. The experience of lionfish envenomation often leaves a lasting impression not because of long-term damage, but because of the intensity and duration of the pain relative to the simplicity of the mistake. A casual brush becomes hours of discomfort, swelling limits movement, and the memory lingers, altering future behavior around docks and ladders. In this way, the lionfish succeeds in its evolutionary goal, deterring contact through negative reinforcement, even when the contact comes from a species it never evolved alongside. By placing lionfish at the dock ladder, this chapter reveals how danger in marine environments often hides in routine, not in dramatic encounters far from shore. The fish does not chase swimmers or attack climbers, but waits where people pass, relying on confidence and defense rather than aggression. Its spines form an invisible perimeter around a body that moves too slowly to register as a threat, until it is already too close, and the pain that follows serves as a lesson written directly into nerve endings rather than memory. In the end, lionfish are not villains or monsters, but specialists thriving in the spaces we have built, reminding us that infrastructure does not exclude nature, but reshapes it. At the dock ladder, where hands reach instinctively and eyes focus upward toward air and light, the lionfish hovers below, perfectly adapted, venomous spines extended not in hostility, but in quiet readiness. The water may feel shallow and familiar, but the rules remain those of the reef, where every fin ray carries consequence and every careless brush has a cost measured not in blood, but in hours of burning pain and swelling that refuse to be ignored. Between coral heads, where reefs loosen their grip and dissolve into patches of sand and rubble, the seafloor takes on an unfinished look, neither fully built nor fully erased, a mosaic of hard structure and soft substrate that invites curiosity because it appears incomplete. These sandy corridors are where snorkelers drift low, where divers hover inches above the bottom, and where hands often reach instinctively toward holes that seem to promise harmless discoveries like empty shells, shy gobies, or nothing at all. The sand here is peppered with small round openings, some cleanly edged, others reinforced with bits of coral or shell fragments, and most look like nothing more than ventilation shafts for worms or abandoned shelters left behind by creatures too small to matter. Yet within many of these burrows lives one of the fastest and most violently efficient predators in the ocean, an animal that compresses extraordinary power into a space no wider than a human thumb, turning the innocent act of probing a hole into a sudden encounter with force that arrives faster than pain can register. When a mantis shrimp occupies a burrow, it does not advertise its presence through movement or sound, because its survival depends on the opposite, on remaining an unseen weapon embedded in the seabed. The animal constructs its tunnel with care, reinforcing the walls to prevent collapse and shaping the entrance to allow a clear line of sight into the surrounding sand, creating a field of vision that extends outward like a surveillance cone. For long stretches of time, nothing appears to live there at all, until two independently moving eyes rise into view, mounted on stalks that swivel and scan with mechanical precision, followed by delicate antennae that taste the water for chemical cues. These eyes are not decorative or exaggerated features, but among the most complex visual organs in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting polarized light and subtle color contrasts that allow the mantis shrimp to identify prey, rivals, and threats with extraordinary clarity, even in the shifting light conditions of shallow reefs. The burrow itself functions as both fortress and firing chamber, anchoring the mantis shrimp in a stable position from which it can launch strikes without compromising its balance or exposing its body. The sandy substrate absorbs excess vibration and conceals the animal's movements, while the surrounding coral fragments provide visual clutter that breaks up outlines and makes it difficult for larger predators to pinpoint the burrow's occupant. From this hidden position, the mantis shrimp waits, not passively, but in a state of constant readiness, muscles preloaded like compressed springs and sensory systems tuned to the slightest disturbance at the entrance. The animal's posture reflects its role as an ambush specialist, with its raptorial appendages folded beneath the body and locked into place, storing energy that will be released only when the geometry of distance and angle aligns perfectly. The reputation of the mantis shrimp rests on these appendages, particularly in species known as smashers, whose club-like limbs deliver impact so fast and so forceful that they challenge intuition about what is possible at small scales. The strike is powered by a latch mechanism rather than direct muscle contraction, allowing energy to be stored slowly and released explosively, a strategy similar to a crossbow rather than a punch. When the latch releases, the club accelerates through the water at such speed that it generates cavitation bubbles, pockets of vapor that form when pressure drops suddenly and then collapse with a secondary shockwave. This means that the target experiences not one impact but two. The physical blow of the club followed milliseconds later by the implosion of the bubble, compounding the damage and ensuring that shells crack, exoskeletons shatter, and tissue ruptures even if the initial contact is imperfect. In natural settings, this capability allows mantis shrimp to prey on animals that would otherwise be protected by armor, including snails, crabs, and bivalves, whose shells evolved specifically to resist crushing predators. The mantis shrimp defeats these defenses not through persistence, but through overwhelming force applied at precise points, often striking repeatedly at the same location until structural failure propagates through the shell. The animal's burrow becomes littered with fragments, a midden of broken calcium carbonate that silently marks its territory and testifies to the success of its method. These fragments also serve a secondary function, reinforcing the burrow walls and entrance, creating a feedback loop in which successful hunting directly improves shelter quality and defensive strength. For humans, the danger lies not in being targeted as prey, but in accidentally placing vulnerable tissue within the effective range of a weapon designed to destroy rigid structures. Fingers probing into a burrow, toes brushing against its entrance, or hands steadying against the sand can all cross an invisible boundary, triggering a defensive or territorial strike that arrives with devastating consequences. The club does not distinguish between shell and bone, because its evolutionary role is to deliver force sufficient to break materials far harder than human flesh. And the result of contact can include deep lacerations, shattered fingernails, and fractures that seem disproportionate to the size of the animal involved. In confined spaces like a burrow entrance, there is no room for a glancing blow, and the mantis shrimp's accuracy ensures that the strike lands squarely on whatever has intruded. The reason these encounters feel so shocking is that the strike happens faster than the human nervous system can process, with the hand or foot already injured before pain signals fully register. High-speed footage reveals that the mantis shrimp's club reaches peak velocity in less time than it takes for water to visibly move around it, creating an impression of teleportation rather than motion. When applied to human skin, this results in injuries that appear suddenly and without warning, reinforcing the sensation that something explosive has occurred, rather than a simple bite or pinch. The presence of cavitation further complicates the injury, as the collapsing bubbles can cause additional tissue damage beyond the point of impact, a phenomenon rarely encountered outside of industrial or military contexts. Ecologically, the mantis shrimp occupies a crucial role in shaping the sandy margins of reefs, acting as both predator and engineer within its microhabitat. By controlling populations of hard-shelled invertebrates, it influences competition and resource availability, preventing any single species from dominating these transitional zones. Its burrowing activity aerates the sand and redistributes sediment, affecting microbial communities and nutrient cycling at small scales that accumulate into broader ecosystem effects. In this way, the mantis shrimp contributes to reef health not through visible dominance, but through constant, localized interactions that maintain balance along the reef's edges. The animal's behavior also illustrates a broader principle of reef ecology, which is that danger often concentrates in the spaces that appear least dramatic, where bright colors and large animals give way to subtle textures and small openings. Coral heads and open water attract attention, but the sandy gaps between them host a dense network of hidden interactions, many of which involve predators that rely on surprise rather than pursuit. The mantis shrimp exemplifies this strategy, compressing lethal capability into a small, unassuming package that thrives precisely because it is overlooked. Its success highlights the importance of scale in understanding ecosystems, reminding observers that the absence of obvious threats does not equate to safety. Slow-motion visualizations of mantis shrimp strikes have transformed scientific understanding of these animals, revealing the mechanics behind their reputation and offering a rare glimpse into processes that unfold too quickly for the naked eye. In these slowed sequences, the club's movement becomes visible as a blur of acceleration, the water around it flashing with cavitation bubbles that shimmer and collapse, and the target disintegrating under forces that seem wildly out of proportion to the attacker's size. Translating this perspective to human interaction requires imagining the burrow not as a hole, but as a loaded weapon aimed outward, with the entrance marking the muzzle and the mantis shrimp poised just behind it, finger on the trigger of an evolutionary mechanism refined over millions of years. The irony of the mantis shrimp's danger lies in how strongly it conflicts with human expectations about threat, because it does not conform to familiar warning signs like large teeth, aggressive postures, or overt movement. Instead, it hides its most dangerous features behind stillness and small scale, relying on the assumption that anything capable of serious harm must announce itself. This assumption fails spectacularly in the mantis shrimp's presence, where the absence of movement signals readiness rather than safety, and where the most innocuous-looking hole can conceal a strike more forceful than many encounters with much larger animals. Understanding this dynamic reshapes how people interact with reef environments, encouraging a shift from exploration by touch to observation by distance, and from casual curiosity to informed caution. The mantis shrimp does not seek conflict with humans, nor does it benefit from injuring something it cannot eat, but its defensive instincts and territorial nature ensure that intrusions into its burrow are met with immediate and overwhelming response. In this sense, injuries occur not because the animal is aggressive, but because its world is structured around the assumption that anything entering its shelter poses an existential threat, requiring instant neutralization. By focusing attention on the mantis shrimp's burrow as a site of compressed power, this chapter reveals how danger on the reef often emerges not from size or ferocity, but from specialization and speed, from animals that turn small spaces into arenas of extreme performance. The sandy patches between corals, so often dismissed as empty or transitional, become zones of heightened risk and ecological importance, filled with hidden actors whose influence extends far beyond their physical dimensions. The mantis shrimp, waiting with eyes just above the sand and clubs folded beneath its body, embodies this reality perfectly. A bullet chambered beneath the seabed, reminding anyone who explores these spaces by hand that the reef does not tolerate carelessness, and that sometimes the most violent forces are the ones you never see coming. Rocky shorelines feel solid in a way that sand never does, promising stability through hardness, texture, and the reassuring resistance of stone underfoot. Yet this confidence is exactly what makes them dangerous at the margins, where land dissolves into sea. At low tide, the exposed reef and intertidal platforms become a maze of wet rock, shallow pools, and narrow channels, each surface polished smooth by waves and edged with algae that turns footing uncertain without appearing overtly hostile. People instinctively lower their center of gravity here, crouching, stepping carefully, and most importantly reaching down with their hands for balance, trusting that rock will behave like rock, and that anything living will move out of the way. What this assumption ignores is that the intertidal zone is not a static landscape, but a layered battlefield, and beneath ledges, Inside cracks, and under the very rocks that seem safest to grip, lives a class of animals perfectly adapted to transform a moment of human imbalance into injury. Crabs dominate these environments not through size or speed, but through leverage and geometry, occupying crevices that align perfectly with the way hands and feet interact with rock. Their bodies are built low and wide, allowing them to wedge into narrow spaces where larger predators cannot reach, while their legs anchor them against surge and wave impact with remarkable stability. The rock pools and shore platforms are their territory, shaped by tidal rhythms that expose them to air for hours and then submerge them beneath breaking waves, demanding a resilience that few animals possess. In this fluctuating environment, crabs have evolved to treat every overhang and crack as potential shelter and every opening as a defensive choke point, turning the intertidal zone into a minefield of hidden force. When a person approaches a rock pool, attention is often drawn upward and outward toward the water's surface, the small fish darting between pools, or the patterns of foam left behind by retreating waves, while the immediate contact points receive only cursory inspection. A hand slides into a crevice to steady a step, fingers curling around what feels like solid stone, and it is at this moment that the illusion collapses. The crab does not rush or chase, because it does not need to, remaining motionless until the intrusion enters its personal space, where distance collapses and reaction time becomes irrelevant. From within its shelter, the crab interprets the sudden pressure and shadow as an existential threat, and its response is immediate and mechanical, driven by reflexes refined for survival in a place where hesitation means death. The claws that deliver this response are not delicate tools, but industrial instruments shaped by millions of years of shell-crushing warfare. Many shore and reef crabs feed on snails, clams, and other armored invertebrates whose defenses consist of calcium carbonate structures evolved to resist pressure, and the crab's solution to this problem has been to evolve claws capable of exerting extraordinary force over a small contact area. The muscles controlling these claws are proportionally massive, filling much of the crab's body cavity and anchored to thickened exoskeletal plates that prevent deformation during use. When the claw closes, it does so with a force sufficient to fracture shells that withstand pounding waves and predatory fish, and it does not release easily, because in the crab's world, letting go of prey or threat before it is neutralized is not an option. Applied to human anatomy, this force translates into injuries that are both immediate and structurally complex, because fingers and hands are not designed to resist crushing loads concentrated at a single point. Fingernails split along their length, nail beds tear, and the soft tissues beneath are compressed against bone, causing deep bruising and lacerations even without visible breaks in the skin. In more severe cases, the crab's grip can trap tendons or joints, locking fingers in place and turning the hand itself into an anchor point, preventing withdrawal and forcing the person to redistribute their weight suddenly. On slick, algae-coated rock, this shift in balance often leads to a fall, and the intertidal zone offers no forgiving surfaces, only sharp edges, barnacle-encrusted ledges, and angular stones that turn a single misjudged grip into a cascade of injuries. What makes these encounters particularly dangerous is that the crab's behavior is defensive rather than aggressive, meaning it occurs precisely when a person believes they are acting cautiously. The crab does not pursue hands or feet, but reacts to pressure and confinement, interpreting intrusion as predation and responding accordingly. Its sideways posture, so often caricatured as awkward or comical, is in fact an adaptation that allows it to present its claws forward while keeping its body aligned with narrow spaces, maximizing leverage and stability. Within a crevice, the crab becomes nearly impossible to dislodge, bracing its legs against opposing rock surfaces and using its body as a living wedge, ensuring that any force applied by the intruding hand is met with equal resistance. The intertidal environment reinforces this advantage through constant mechanical stress, which is selected for animals capable of maintaining grip under extreme conditions. Waves surge unpredictably, water levels rise and fall, and debris crashes through channels with little warning, yet crabs persist by clinging to rock with tenacity that borders on absolute. This same grip, when transferred to human skin, creates a situation where the instinctive response to pull away only increases damage, as the claw's serrated edges dig deeper, and the crab tightens its hold in response to perceived struggle. Unlike a bite, which may release if the attacker retreats, the crab's clamp is a locking mechanism designed to maintain contact until the threat stops moving or the crab itself chooses to disengage. Ecologically, crabs occupy a critical role as both predators and scavengers in tide pools, regulating populations of smaller invertebrates and recycling organic matter that would otherwise accumulate. Their presence shapes the structure of the intertidal community, influencing which species can settle and persist on exposed rock and which must retreat to deeper water. This role requires them to be fearless in confined spaces, willing to confront threats larger than themselves, because retreat is often impossible in a landscape defined by hard boundaries. As a result, crabs have evolved a mindset and physiology that favors confrontation over escape when cornered, a strategy that works exceptionally well against natural predators but becomes hazardous when applied to human interaction. The danger increases during transitional tides, when water levels are changing and surfaces shift from submerged to exposed, creating uncertainty in footing and encouraging frequent hand placement for balance. At these moments, crabs are often most active, emerging from deeper refuges to forage as new areas become accessible, increasing the likelihood of overlap between human and crab activity. The rocks that feel newly exposed and safe may already be occupied by animals that have been waiting beneath the surface, poised to defend their shelters as soon as the water recedes. This overlap creates a narrow window where human caution is high but incomplete, and where the consequences of a single mistake are amplified by the environment's unforgiving texture. The irony of these injuries lies in their origin, because they do not result from recklessness or confrontation, but from the instinctive act of seeking stability in an unstable environment. The hand reaches down to prevent a fall, and instead becomes the cause of one, caught by an animal whose entire existence revolves around refusing to yield space. In this sense, crabs function as sideways landmines, not because they actively target humans, but because their defensive architecture is perfectly aligned with the way people interact with rocks when moving cautiously. The trap is not visible, not audible, and not aggressive, yet it is positioned exactly where the hand expects safety, converting support into hazard in a fraction of a second. Understanding this dynamic requires reframing how the intertidal zone is perceived, shifting from a view of rocks as inert supports to one of rocks as living structures, inhabited and defended by organisms adapted to exploit contact. The safest path across tide pools is not defined solely by where feet can land, but by where hands never need to reach, and by an awareness that every crevice may already be occupied by an animal prepared to respond instantly to intrusion. Crabs do not represent malice or hostility, but rather a mismatch between human assumptions and ecological reality, where the need for balance collides with the need for defense. By examining crabs through this lens, the rocky shoreline transforms from a scenic threshold into a zone of negotiated movement, where stability is earned through distance rather than grip, and caution means observing before touching. The sideways posture, crushing claws, and unyielding grip that make crabs so successful in their environment also make them capable of inflicting serious injury without intent, simply by being exactly what evolution shaped them to be. In the intertidal world, danger does not always announce itself with size or speed, but hides beneath ledges and within cracks, waiting not for prey but for pressure, and reminding anyone who ventures across wet rock that the safest balance is often found not by reaching down, but by staying upright and letting the land remain untouched. At night, reefs change their personality, trading color and spectacle for shadow and tension, and it is in these hours that rock cracks and artificial reefs reveal their true occupants. What looks like an empty hole by day becomes, after sunset, a guarded doorway, marked not by warning signs, but by a pair of stiff antennae extending into open water like feelers testing the dark. Lobsters do not roam the reef openly when light dominates, because their bodies are built for defense rather than speed, and daylight exposes them to predators that read silhouettes easily. Instead, they wedge themselves deep inside caves, crevices, and man-made reef structures, choosing spaces that match their bodies so closely that extraction becomes mechanically difficult even before resistance is applied. From the outside, these shelters appear invitingly simple, a cavity in rock or concrete that seems to offer easy access to what many humans imagine as a free meal. Yet this perception collapses instantly once pressure crosses the threshold of the den. A lobster inside its shelter is not passive or unaware, because the animal's sensory world is tuned precisely to detect intrusion. Long antennae sweep outward continuously, sampling chemical cues and vibrations in the water, translating subtle disturbances into spatial awareness that extends well beyond the animal's visual range. When a hand enters a crevice at night, guided by a flashlight beam and confidence built on shallow water success stories, the lobster feels the displacement long before contact occurs. Its body tenses, muscles loading not for escape, but for engagement, because within the confines of a cave, retreat is rarely an option, and defense becomes the only viable strategy. This readiness is not aggression, but survival logic, shaped by an environment where predators strike suddenly, and shelters are contested resources worth fighting for. The claws that define this encounter are asymmetrical by design, reflecting a division of labor perfected through evolutionary pressure rather than chance. One claw, known as the crusher, is broad, heavy and ridged, designed to exert immense force over a crushing surface capable of breaking shells, coral fragments, and the armored bodies of prey. The other, often referred to as the cutter, is narrower and sharper, specialized for slicing and holding, allowing the lobster to manipulate food once it has been subdued. This asymmetry confers flexibility, but it is the crusher claw that dominates human encounters because it operates less like a pincer and more like a hydraulic press, closing slowly but with an unstoppable increase in pressure that overwhelms resistance rather than reacting to it. When a lobster clamps down on a hand or wrist, the sensation is not immediately explosive, because the closing motion can feel deliberate rather than sudden, lulling the intruder into a false belief that withdrawal is still possible. This perception is dangerously misleading because once the claw reaches full closure, the mechanical advantage of the lobster's musculature becomes apparent, locking joints into place and turning soft tissue into a fixed object caught between rigid surfaces. Lobster claws are adapted to maintain grip under stress, allowing the animal to hold struggling prey against waves and current, and this same adaptation ensures that once a grip is established, release is not reflexive. The claw does not let go simply because the target pulls away, because in the lobster's world, prey resists as a matter of course, and tightening grip is the appropriate response. Panic transforms this situation from painful to catastrophic, because sudden yanking multiplies force at the point of contact, driving the edges of the claw deeper into flesh and compressing bone against unyielding surfaces. Fingertips flatten, knuckles wedge awkwardly against rock, and tendons stretch under loads they were never designed to bear, while the lobster braces itself inside the crevice, legs pushing outward to lock its body in place. The harder the person pulls, the more securely the lobster becomes anchored, turning the cave into a lever that works against the intruder rather than the animal. In shallow water, this struggle destabilizes buoyancy and footing, often forcing the person into awkward positions that increase the risk of injury from surrounding rock, coral, or artificial reef debris. The power behind this grip is not accidental, but a direct consequence of the lobster's ecological role as both predator and competitor within reef systems. Lobsters feed on hard-shelled animals such as clams, mussels, and crustaceans, species that have evolved thick armor specifically to deter predation. And the lobster's crusher claw represents a counter-adaptation in an ongoing evolutionary arms race. Muscles within the claw are arranged to maximize force rather than speed, sacrificing rapid closure for sustained pressure that can fracture shells slowly but reliably. This design means that even when a lobster is not actively squeezing harder, the force already applied is sufficient to maintain immobilization, making escape without intervention unlikely once the claw has fully closed. Artificial reefs amplify these risks by providing ideal lobster habitat in environments where human activity is frequent, creating zones of overlap that did not exist before their placement. Concrete blocks, sunken structures, and reef modules offer deep cavities and stable surfaces that lobsters quickly colonize, turning them into strongholds that persist year after year. At night, these structures attract divers and snorkelers seeking close encounters or attempting to harvest lobsters by hand, often underestimating the animal's defensive capability and overestimating their own control in confined spaces. The darkness further complicates perception, narrowing attention to the illuminated area and reducing awareness of body position, which increases the likelihood of reaching into holes without a clear exit plan. From the lobster's perspective, the intrusion is indistinguishable from an attack by a predator, triggering a response that has been honed through countless encounters with octopus, fish, and other crustaceans competing for shelter. The animal's decision to clamp down is not based on curiosity or aggression, but on the simple rule that anything entering its shelter must be neutralized before it can cause harm. This rule has served lobsters well for millions of years, allowing them to persist in habitats where shelter is scarce and competition is intense, and it does not account for the possibility that the intruder might be a human hand guided by appetite rather than predation. The aftermath of these encounters often extends beyond immediate injury, because the struggle can result in secondary trauma as balance is lost and the environment asserts itself. Sharp rocks scrape skin, coral cuts open exposed areas, and equipment becomes entangled as the person attempts to free themselves, all while the lobster maintains its grip with unyielding persistence. In some cases, individuals are forced to abandon attempts at extraction entirely, retreating from the water with the lobster still attached, a testament to the animal's grip strength and refusal to release until it perceives safety. These incidents underscore the mismatch between human expectations of control and the realities of interacting with animals evolved for mechanical dominance in confined spaces. Ecologically, lobsters play a crucial role in structuring reef communities, influencing the abundance and distribution of prey species and contributing to the recycling of organic material within benthic systems. Their feeding behavior prevents certain mollusks and crustaceans from monopolizing space, maintaining diversity and balance within the reef. This role requires them to confront resistance regularly, reinforcing selection for claws capable of sustained crushing force and behavioral strategies that favor holding ground over retreat. In this context, the lobster's refusal to let go becomes an asset rather than a liability, ensuring success in a competitive environment where hesitation can mean starvation or displacement. The danger for humans arises not from malice, but from misinterpreting this evolutionary toolkit through the lens of convenience and tradition, assuming that because lobsters are harvested regularly, they are inherently manageable. This assumption ignores the context in which harvesting occurs safely, typically involving tools, protective equipment, and an understanding of the animal's behavior that minimizes direct contact. When these safeguards are absent and hands enter dark crevices, guided by confidence rather than caution, the lobster's natural responses take over, producing outcomes that feel disproportionate to the initial action. Night amplifies these dynamics by shifting sensory dominance from vision to touch, both for humans and lobsters, narrowing reaction windows and increasing reliance on instinct. In the darkness, antennae become primary information channels for the lobster, while hands become exploratory tools for the human, setting the stage for direct contact in spaces designed to magnify force. The reef itself recedes into shadow, leaving only the immediate interaction illuminated. And in that narrow cone of light, the lobster's role as cave guard becomes unmistakable, its body wedged deep inside, claws extended, and grip unwavering. Understanding lobsters as guardians of their shelters, rather than passive occupants, reframes these encounters as predictable outcomes of overlapping behaviors rather than accidents. The animal does not chase or pursue, but defends with a persistence shaped by ecological necessity, and its strength is not exaggerated by myth, but grounded in measurable biomechanics. The lesson embedded in these interactions is not about fear, but about respecting the physical realities of animals adapted to confined environments, where leverage, grip, and refusal to yield determine survival. By revealing the lobster's cave as a defended space rather than an opportunity, this chapter exposes a broader truth about reef exploration, which is that danger often lies not in open water, but in the hidden structures that invite hands and curiosity. The antennae extending from a dark hole are not decorative or incidental. but the visible edge of a boundary that should not be crossed without understanding the consequences. In the quiet of a night reef, where light flickers across stone and concrete, the lobster remains still and prepared, a reminder that some meals fight back not with speed or venom, but with patience, leverage, and a grip that does not forgive panic. In the shallow margins of tropical seas, where coral heads rise like scattered ruins from pale sand and seagrass beds, ripple gently with the push and pull of currents. Danger does not always announce itself through speed, size, or aggression. These environments feel approachable because they are close to shore, shallow enough to stand in, and visually calm, offering clear water and soft substrates that suggest safety rather than threat. Snorkelers drift slowly above these channels, divers kneel to adjust fins or clear fogged masks, and waders pause between steps as sunlight fractures across the bottom. It is precisely here, in these transitional spaces between reef and sand, that sea snakes move with deliberate ease, threading through gaps, resting in coils, and blending so completely into the environment that they are often mistaken for shadows or lengths of drifting vegetation. Sea snakes are not frantic hunters patrolling open water, nor are they lurkers waiting to ambush passing animals, but specialists adapted to efficiency and restraint in environments where energy conservation matters. Their bodies are laterally flattened, forming a paddle-like profile that allows them to glide with minimal effort, and their movements are slow, economical, and continuous, giving the impression of creatures unburdened by urgency. Unlike terrestrial snakes that rely on friction against solid ground, sea snakes use the water itself as a medium of support, allowing them to pause mid-motion or rest directly on the seabed without expending significant energy. This behavior places them exactly where human feet and hands often go, curled between rocks, stretched across sand channels, or tucked against coral bases where the reef meets open bottom. The reason sea snakes occupy these spaces lies in their feeding ecology, which ties them closely to the structure of reefs and the subtle contours of sandy corridors. Many species specialize in hunting small fish that hide among coral branches or bury themselves in sediment, and shallow channels act as natural funnels where prey moves between feeding and shelter areas. Sea snakes patrol these zones methodically, probing crevices with their heads, inserting narrow bodies into tight spaces, and occasionally resting in place to conserve energy between foraging bouts. Their reliance on ambush and close-range pursuit means that they do not flee rapidly when approached, because flight in water is costly and unnecessary unless a threat is clearly identified. From a human perspective, this lack of rapid movement is dangerously misleading because stillness is often interpreted as harmlessness. A sea snake resting on the bottom looks inert, its body looped gently, head tucked slightly, breathing slow and almost imperceptible. In shallow water, where fins stir sand and feet search for stable footing, this posture places the animal directly beneath points of contact, and a single misplaced step can compress the snake's body against the substrate before the person realizes what they have touched. Unlike fish that dart away or invertebrates that retract, a sea snake reacts according to a defensive calculus shaped by millions of years of evolution, where sudden pressure signals predation and immediate response determine survival. The defensive bite of a sea snake is not delivered out of aggression, but out of necessity, triggered by entrapment or pain, rather than curiosity or territoriality. When stepped on or pinned, the snake's options narrow dramatically because its elongated body limits its ability to twist free in confined spaces, and its instinctive response is to bite the source of pressure to create an opportunity to escape. The bite itself is often small, sometimes barely puncturing the skin, because the snake is not attempting to hold or chew, but to inject venom quickly and retreat. This subtlety is what makes sea snake envenomation particularly insidious, as the absence of dramatic injury masks the seriousness of what has occurred. Sea snake venom is among the most potent in the reptile world, evolved to immobilize fish rapidly in water where escape is easy and pursuit costly. The venom is primarily neurotoxic and myotoxic, targeting the communication between nerves and muscles and disrupting the ability of muscle fibers to contract. In prey, this results in near instantaneous paralysis, preventing swimming and allowing the snake to swallow its catch without resistance. In humans, The same mechanism unfolds on a larger scale, with venom molecules spreading through tissue and bloodstream, interfering with muscle control and gradually shutting down voluntary movement. The progression of symptoms can be deceptively slow, beginning with mild discomfort or stiffness that does not seem proportional to the tiny puncture wound, and advancing over hours rather than minutes. Muscles begin to weaken, reflexes dull, and coordination falters, as the venom interferes with neuromuscular junctions responsible for transmitting signals from nerves to muscle fibers. In severe cases, this process extends to the muscles responsible for breathing, including the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, creating a situation where consciousness remains intact while the body's ability to draw breath diminishes. The danger lies not in immediate pain or visible trauma, but in the silent progression of paralysis that can escalate rapidly without intervention. What makes these encounters particularly dangerous is the context in which they occur, because shallow reef environments encourage self-reliance and delayed response, with people often far from medical facilities and unaware of the seriousness of the situation. The initial bite may be dismissed as a scratch or minor injury, especially if the snake retreats immediately and the wound shows little bleeding. Meanwhile, venom continues to act internally, and the window for effective treatment narrows as time passes. This mismatch between perceived severity and actual risk contributes to the disproportionately high danger associated with sea snake bites, despite their relative rarity. From an ecological standpoint, the sea snake's presence in shallow reef channels reflects a broader pattern of adaptation to life at the interface of land and sea. Sea snakes have evolved specialized lungs that extend much of the length of their bodies, aiding buoyancy and allowing fine control over vertical position in the water column. Some species can absorb oxygen directly through their skin, supplementing lung breathing and enabling longer dives, a feature particularly useful when resting on the seabed. These adaptations allow sea snakes to remain submerged and motionless for extended periods, further increasing the likelihood of unnoticed overlap with human activity. Their behavior is also shaped by the absence of terrestrial predators and the relative safety of open water, which reduces the need for constant vigilance and rapid escape responses. Instead of fleeing at the first sign of disturbance, sea snakes assess threats based on direct contact and confinement, responding only when escape routes are compromised. This strategy conserves energy and suits an environment where most encounters are non-threatening, but it creates a dangerous intersection with human behavior that relies on stepping, standing, and kneeling in precisely the spaces sea snakes use as resting and hunting grounds. The irony of sea snake danger lies in how strongly it contrasts with their demeanor, because these animals are often described as docile, slow-moving, and uninterested in humans, descriptions that are largely accurate yet incomplete. Sea snakes do not seek confrontation, but they're also not equipped with warning displays or aggressive postures that signal boundaries clearly to large, unfamiliar animals. Their warning comes only when contact has already occurred, and by then the conditions for a defensive bite may already be met. This lack of visible escalation makes their danger feel unfair or unexpected, even though it is a predictable outcome of overlapping behaviors in a shared environment. The sandy channels and seagrass beds that host sea snakes are dynamic systems shaped by tides, currents, and light, creating shifting patterns of use that bring snakes and humans together at specific times. Low tide exposes more of the seabed, encouraging wading and standing, while also concentrating fish in remaining channels where sea snakes hunt. Calm conditions invite longer stops and relaxed posture, increasing the chance of stationary contact, while poor visibility from stirred sediment reduces the ability to detect coiled bodies on the bottom. These factors converge most strongly in the very shallow depths that feel safest, creating a paradox where reduced water depth increases rather than decreases risk. Understanding sea snakes within this ecological framework reframes the narrative from one of aggressive venomous animals to one of spatial conflict and misinterpretation. The snake is not defending territory, asserting dominance, or attacking out of fear, but responding to physical constraint in an environment where its primary defenses are chemical rather than mechanical. The venom that evolved to ensure feeding success becomes, in these moments, a last resort escape mechanism, deployed with precision but carrying consequences far beyond the snake's intent. The lesson embedded in these encounters is not about avoiding reefs or fearing snakes, but about recognizing that shallow water is not empty space, and that the bottom is as biologically active as the water above it. Standing still, kneeling, or stepping down without visual confirmation carries inherent risk in ecosystems where animals use the substrate as habitat rather than merely surface. Sea snakes, resting quietly between coral heads and across sandy corridors, embody this reality, serving as reminders that danger in the ocean often resides not in dramatic movement, but in calm overlap. By placing viewers at this interface, where human routines intersect with ancient evolutionary strategies, the sea snake becomes a symbol of how subtle and serious marine hazards can be. The tiny puncture that barely marks the skin belies a biochemical cascade capable of shutting down muscles and breath, demonstrating that in the ocean, scale is deceptive and impact is often invisible. In these shallow reefs, where light dances across sand and life moves slowly, venom waits not in pursuit, but in stillness, and survival depends on understanding that the safest step is often the one not taken without looking. On shallow reefs and sandy margins where coral fragments scatter like broken masonry, the seabed often feels calm and observational rather than predatory, a place where fish pause instead of hunt and where encounters unfold slowly enough to feel controllable. In these zones, puffer fish drift low or rest directly on the bottom, propped on their fins like sentries leaning against an invisible wall, watching divers and snorkelers pass overhead with large, mobile eyes that seem more curious than cautious. Their movement is unhurried and deliberate, more hovering than swimming, and their rounded bodies soften the geometry of the reef, making them appear harmless, even playful, in an environment otherwise defined by sharp edges and defensive silhouettes. This combination of stillness, eye contact, and apparent vulnerability invites attention, and it is here that misunderstanding begins. Pufferfish are not inactive because they are slow or defenseless, but because they occupy an ecological niche where deterrence replaces escape and chemistry replaces force. Their bodies are compact and muscular beneath loose, elastic skin, capable of sudden bursts of movement when necessary, yet they rarely need to flee because their primary defense is psychological and biochemical rather than mechanical. When threatened, a puffer does not chase or bite, but inflates, transforming from an unremarkable oval into a rigid sphere studded with spines or reinforced by sheer size, an act that is both visually dramatic and functionally decisive. This inflation makes the fish difficult or impossible to swallow, turning predation into a dangerous gamble for any animal that misjudges its capabilities. This behavior has been sensationalized into spectacle, particularly in tourist settings, where the inflation response is treated as a novelty rather than a last resort, and people attempt to provoke it by touching, lifting, or cornering the fish. The puffer's tolerance of proximity reinforces the illusion that it is safe to handle because it often allows humans to approach closely without fleeing, maintaining eye contact, and adjusting position subtly rather than bolting away. This calmness is not trust, but confidence rooted in the knowledge that contact carries consequences for the aggressor, consequences that are invisible but severe. The true danger of pufferfish lies not in their inflation or spines, but in the presence of tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin so potent that it disrupts nerve function at extremely low doses. This toxin is concentrated in the fish's skin, liver, ovaries, and other organs, and acts by blocking sodium channels in nerve cells, preventing the transmission of electrical signals required for muscle contraction and sensory perception. In practical terms, this means that exposure to tetrodotoxin can result in numbness, paralysis, and respiratory failure, while consciousness may remain intact, trapping the victim in a body that can no longer respond. The toxin is not produced by the puffer itself, but accumulated through its diet and symbiotic bacteria, tying its danger directly to ecological relationships rather than inherent aggression. In natural settings, tetrodotoxin serves as a powerful deterrent against predation, teaching predators through fatal or near-fatal mistakes that puffers are not food. The toxin's effectiveness is such that even animals capable of consuming spiny or armored prey avoid puffers entirely once exposure occurs. reinforcing the fish's evolutionary strategy of slow movement and visible presence. This chemical shield allows puffers to forage openly on sand and rubble, feeding on algae, small invertebrates, and benthic organisms without the constant vigilance required by more vulnerable species. Their role in the ecosystem includes controlling populations of hard-shelled organisms and contributing to nutrient cycling, tasks that benefit from the freedom to operate in exposed areas without fear. Human encounters with puffers often occur when this evolutionary balance is disrupted by curiosity rather than predation, particularly in shallow water where people feel comfortable kneeling, standing, or reaching down. A puffer resting on the bottom appears approachable, its rounded form and expressive eyes inviting interaction, and some people attempt to pick the fish up to see it inflate, unaware that this response is a sign of extreme stress rather than entertainment. In these moments, the risk is not being bitten or stung, but transferring toxin through skin contact, particularly when small cuts, abrasions, or broken skin provide an entry point. The danger escalates when handling is followed by careless behavior, such as rubbing eyes, touching lips, or contacting other sensitive areas before washing hands thoroughly. Tetrodotoxin does not need to be injected to cause harm, because mucous membranes and open wounds provide direct access to the bloodstream, and even small amounts can trigger neurological symptoms. Fishermen who handle puffers while removing hooks, tourists who pose for photographs holding inflated fish, and children who poke or prod them in tide pools have all experienced consequences that seem disproportionate to the act, developing numbness in fingers, tingling around the mouth, dizziness or weakness that escalates rapidly. Stories from coastal communities often share a common pattern, beginning with the assumption that a fish without teeth or obvious weapons is safe to touch, followed by delayed symptoms that defy expectations. A fisherman cleans a net after freeing a puffer and later rubs his eyes, only to feel burning and numbness spread across his face, while another handles a puffer bare-handed and then eats without washing, introducing toxin orally. In more severe cases, ingestion of improperly prepared puffer meat has led to paralysis and death, a risk well known in regions where specialized training is required to prepare the fish safely. These incidents underscore the reality that puffer fish are not dangerous because they attack, but because they carry consequences that persist beyond the moment of contact. From a physiological perspective, the puffer's inflation mechanism itself is a marvel of adaptation, involving rapid intake of water or air into a specialized stomach that expands dramatically without rupturing tissue. This process increases body volume several times over, making the fish too large for most predators to handle and exposing spines or rigid surfaces that further discourage attack. The energy cost of inflation is high, which is why puffers avoid using it unless necessary, and repeated forced inflation can exhaust or even kill the fish, adding an ethical dimension to human interactions that treat this defense as a trick rather than a survival response. The calm demeanor of puffers also reflects their reliance on sensory awareness rather than flight, as they assess threats through vision and chemical cues, adjusting position subtly to maintain distance without expending energy. Their eyes move independently, scanning surroundings with precision, and their behavior often includes following divers or snorkelers at a distance, not out of curiosity alone, but to monitor potential disturbance. This watchfulness creates the impression of engagement, encouraging people to believe the fish is interactive or tame, when in reality, it is simply evaluating risk. Within an environment, it understands far better than the observer. Ecologically, pufferfish occupy an important role in reef and sandy bottom communities, influencing the abundance of invertebrates and algae, and serving as a reservoir for tetrodotoxin within the food web. Their presence shapes predator behavior and contributes to the chemical landscape of the ecosystem, reinforcing boundaries that define who eats whom. Some species of predators have evolved resistance to tetrodotoxin, allowing them to consume puffers safely, demonstrating an ongoing evolutionary arms race that highlights the toxin's significance beyond human interactions. This dynamic underscores that the puffer's danger is not incidental, but integral to its role within marine systems. The irony of pufferfish encounters is that they occur most often in moments of perceived safety, when water is shallow, visibility is high, and the fish itself appears passive. Divers rest on sandy bottoms to adjust gear. Snorkelers hover above rubble fields, and waders pause to watch fish at their feet, all unaware that the very stillness and approachability of the puffer are products of an evolutionary strategy that assumes contact will be punished chemically rather than physically. The fish does not need to flee or fight because its defense operates on a scale that outlasts the interaction, ensuring that even brief mishandling carries lasting consequences. Understanding pufferfish as chemical deterrents rather than playful curiosities reframes how shallow marine environments should be navigated, emphasizing observation over contact and respect over novelty. The balloon waiting on the bottom is not an invitation, but a warning encoded in behavior rather than appearance, a signal that danger does not always present itself through aggression or speed. In the reef's quieter corners, where sand meets coral rubble and life slows to a deliberate pace, the puffer embodies a different kind of hazard, one that waits patiently for ignorance rather than chasing prey. By placing this chapter among stories of spines, claws, and venom, the pufferfish adds a layer of complexity to the narrative of marine danger, reminding us that the ocean's most effective defenses are often invisible and delayed. The toxin does not burn like a sting or crush like a claw, but slips silently into the body, interrupting the most fundamental processes that sustain life. In this sense, the pufferfish represents a lesson written in chemistry rather than force, demonstrating that in the marine world, the smallest interactions can carry the greatest consequences, and that sometimes the most dangerous animal is the one that does nothing at all until it is touched. At the margins where land yields reluctantly to the sea, danger often takes the form of abundance rather than rarity, spreading across rock and reef until it becomes part of the landscape itself. Volcanic shorelines, concrete breakwaters, and shallow reef edges are classic entry points for swimmers and snorkelers because they promise firm footing and easy access. Yet these same features host one of the most quietly punishing hazards in coastal ecosystems. Sea urchins gather here not as isolated individuals, but as dense living carpets, their round bodies wedged into cracks and depressions, spines radiating outward until the rock itself seems to bristle. From a distance, this looks like texture rather than life, a dark fuzz clinging to stone, but up close it becomes clear that the surface is armed, layered, and unforgiving. Sea urchins are not aggressive animals, nor do they move toward anything with intent, but they are masters of occupying space in a way that makes mistakes expensive. Their bodies are rigid tests made of fused plates, anchoring them firmly against wave action, while hundreds of spines extend in every direction, forming a defensive halo that functions continuously rather than reactively. These spines are not sharp in the way blades are sharp, but brittle and needle-thin, evolved to snap rather than bend, ensuring that anything pressing against them receives fragments embedded deep in tissue rather than a single clean puncture. This design reflects a survival strategy built around inevitability, where contact equals consequence and retreat by the intruder is not enough to reverse the damage already done. The classic scenario unfolds in seconds and begins with confidence, because the rocks look solid and the water looks shallow. A person steps down from a ledge, slips slightly on algae-slick stone, or jumps feet first into what appears to be a clear patch, only to land squarely on an urchin-covered surface. Dozens of spines penetrate simultaneously, driven by body weight through the soles of feet or the sides of ankles, snapping on impact and lodging fragments beneath the skin. Pain flares immediately, sharp and spreading, but the true severity is often masked by adrenaline and surprise, leading to attempts to stand, walk, or climb out that only drive fragments deeper and distribute them around joints and tendons. What makes sea urchin injuries uniquely persistent is the nature of the spines themselves, which are composed largely of calcium carbonate arranged in a crystalline structure that fractures easily and resists clean extraction. When spines break beneath the skin, they leave behind jagged pieces that the body struggles to expel, triggering inflammation as immune cells attempt to isolate and dissolve the foreign material. This process takes time, sometimes weeks or months, during which swelling, stiffness, and pain can persist, particularly when fragments lodge near joints where movement constantly irritates the surrounding tissue. The injury becomes less about the initial puncture and more about prolonged interaction between living tissue and dissolving mineral, turning a momentary slip into a long recovery. Infections add another layer of risk because puncture wounds created by spines provide direct access for bacteria present on the rock surface or within the urchin itself. Warm, shallow waters are rich in microbial life, and spines driven deep into flesh can carry these organisms with them, seeding infections that may not be immediately obvious. Redness, heat, and increasing pain can develop days after the incident, catching victims off guard once the initial shock has faded. In severe cases, untreated infections can spread along tendon sheaths or into joints, complicating recovery and requiring medical intervention far beyond basic first aid. The ecological role of sea urchins explains why these encounters are becoming more common rather than less, particularly in regions where overfishing has altered predator populations. Urchins are voracious grazers, feeding primarily on algae, and in balanced ecosystems, their numbers are kept in check by predators such as sea otters, large fish, and lobsters. When these predators decline due to fishing pressure or habitat loss, urchin populations can explode, transforming diverse reefs into what are known as urchin barrens. In these barren zones, algae are stripped away almost entirely, leaving exposed rock coated in spines rather than vegetation, and the shoreline becomes a continuous hazard zone rather than a patchwork of risk. Urchin barrens change not only the visual character of the reef, but its physical interaction with humans, because areas that once offered soft algal cover or clear pathways become densely armored surfaces. Entry points that were once manageable turn treacherous, and familiar spots accumulate more spines with each passing season. This shift is not random, but a direct consequence of ecological imbalance, illustrating how human activity far offshore can translate into hazards at the water's edge. The carpet of needles is not merely an inconvenience, but a visible symptom of disrupted food webs and altered energy flow within coastal systems. From the urchin's perspective, this expansion is not an invasion, but an opportunity, as the absence of predators allows them to occupy open space without fear. Their survival strategy relies on persistence rather than mobility, clinging to rock through powerful tube feet that grip irregular surfaces and resist dislodgement even under heavy wave action. These tube feet, combined with the rigid test and flexible spines, allow urchins to maintain position in some of the most turbulent environments along the coast, ensuring that once they establish themselves, they remain. This stability turns entire stretches of shoreline into static minefields, where danger does not shift or retreat with time of day or tide. The pain associated with sea urchin injuries often leads to improvised responses that worsen outcomes, such as attempting to dig out spines with tools or forcefully squeezing the area, which can drive fragments deeper or break them further. Because spines are brittle, aggressive removal frequently results in incomplete extraction, leaving behind material that continues to irritate tissue. The slow dissolution of these fragments under the skin can create a cycle of inflammation that flares repeatedly, especially during movement, making walking or swimming uncomfortable long after the initial injury. In some cases, scar tissue forms around retained fragments, altering joint mechanics and causing chronic discomfort. Understanding sea urchins as a hazard requires recognizing that their danger is cumulative rather than immediate, built into their abundance and distribution rather than any single encounter. Unlike venomous fish or biting predators, urchins do not rely on a dramatic moment of contact to make their point, but instead enforce caution through persistence. The shoreline covered in spines does not surprise or chase, but waits, indifferent to time, turning complacency into injury through simple physics. The weight of a body, the angle of a step, the loss of balance are all it takes to activate a defense that never turns off. There is a subtle irony in how sea urchins affect human behavior, because they often occupy exactly the places people choose for safety. Volcanic rock looks stable compared to sand, breakwaters feel secure compared to open water, and shallow reef edges promise control over depth and footing. These preferences align perfectly with the urchin's needs for hard substrate and wave-washed environments, creating zones of inevitable overlap. The result is not an increase in aggressive encounters, but an increase in unavoidable contact, as both species follow the same logic for different reasons. In regions where conservation efforts restore predator populations, changes in urchin density can be dramatic, with barren areas gradually giving way to more diverse habitats as grazing pressure eases. These shifts demonstrate that the carpet of needles is not a permanent feature, but a reversible condition tied directly to ecosystem balance. For people navigating these shores, this context matters because it reframes injuries not as accidents caused by careless steps, but as outcomes shaped by broader environmental trends. The pain in a foot becomes a data point in a larger story about ecological resilience and collapse. The lesson embedded in sea urchin encounters is one of scale and accumulation, showing how small, individually harmless organisms can collectively create significant risk. Each spine is minor, but dozens together produce injury that rivals more dramatic marine hazards, and the slow healing process ensures the memory lingers. This persistence mirrors the urchin's own ecological strategy, surviving not through speed or stealth, but through numbers and durability. By the time a person carefully lifts a foot from a spined rock, the interaction is already complete. Fragments embedded, inflammation underway, and recovery begun. The water may look unchanged, the rock may look the same, but the body carries the imprint of that contact for weeks or months afterward. In this sense, sea urchins redefine what danger looks like at the shoreline, shifting it from sudden events to enduring consequences. In the end, the carpet of needles on the rocks is not a warning sign erected by nature, but a condition created by long-term processes, visible to those who know how to read it and invisible to those who do not. It turns entry points into lessons, forcing awareness through pain rather than fear, and reminding anyone who steps into the sea that stability is an illusion easily punctured. Along volcanic shores, breakwaters, and shallow reef edges, the sea urchin waits without intent or malice. Its spines raised not in aggression, but in quiet defense, transforming the simple act of standing into a negotiation with an ecosystem that does not forgive imbalance. Along reef walls and scattered boulder fields, the ocean builds vertical spaces that invite hands long before they invite thought. These are the places where coral rises abruptly from sand, where volcanic rock fractures into stacked blocks, and where erosion carves deep pockets into stone, creating natural ladders and ledges that feel useful rather than dangerous. Divers drift close to these walls to steady themselves against surge, snorkelers reach down to regain balance, and swimmers moving through shallow passes instinctively grab whatever solid structure presents itself. The reef, however, is not a staircase, and many of its most convenient handholds are already occupied by animals that evolved to treat dark holes not as empty space, but as defended territory. Moray eels are the dominant residents of these crevices, bodies threaded deep into rock like living cables, heads protruding just enough to sample the water and watch the flow of life outside their shelters. From a distance, a moray looks like a stationary ornament of the reef, its mouth opening and closing rhythmically in what appears to be a perpetual snarl, teeth exposed, eyes fixed forward. This display often reads as aggression to human observers, but it is neither threat nor warning, merely respiration, the eel pumping water across its gills while remaining otherwise motionless. That stillness, combined with the familiarity of reef holes as grip points, sets the stage for one of the most severe hand-to-animal injuries in shallow marine environments. Moray eels are built for a very specific ecological role, one that prioritizes ambush and confinement over pursuit. Their bodies are long, muscular, and laterally compressed, allowing them to occupy narrow spaces inaccessible to most predators, while their skin lacks scales and instead secretes a thick layer of mucus that reduces abrasion against rock. This mucus also carries antimicrobial properties, protecting the eel from infection in environments where cuts and scrapes are inevitable, an adaptation that becomes relevant when considering the aftermath of human injuries. Inside the reef, the moray is not exposed or vulnerable, but perfectly positioned, with only its head and sensory organs facing outward into the water column. Vision plays a limited role in the moray's world, particularly behind the plane of its eyes, because their visual field is oriented forward and outward from the crevice, rather than backward into the hole. This means that anything entering the cavity from above or behind is not clearly identified through sight, forcing the eel to rely on other sensory systems to interpret intrusion. Chemoreception dominates here, with the eel's sense of smell guiding feeding behavior far more strongly than visual recognition. In the tight confines of a reef hole, a sudden object entering the space registers not as a hand or arm, but as pressure, shadow, and scent. Signals that, in the eel's evolutionary history, correspond almost exclusively to prey or threat. Morays are opportunistic predators that feed primarily on fish, octopus, and crustaceans, animals that often attempt to escape into holes and crevices to avoid capture. Over millions of years, this has shaped a response pattern that favors immediate action rather than cautious assessment. When movement or scent appears inside the eel's shelter, the correct response is to bite first, because hesitation allows prey to escape or competitors to gain ground. This feeding logic does not include a category for human hands, wetsuits, or fingers gripping rock. And when such objects appear suddenly in the eel's personal space, the eel responds according to the only rule that has ever worked. The bite itself is fast, decisive, and far more destructive than its size suggests, because moray jaws are not designed to hold and release, but to seize and drag. The teeth are long, sharp, and angled backward, optimized to prevent escape once contact is made, and the eel's neck muscles deliver powerful lateral force that tears rather than punctures. Unlike animals that bite defensively and then withdraw, morays often maintain their grip, twisting their bodies to leverage the confined space and pull tissue deeper into the crevice. This behavior is not malicious, but mechanical, an extension of feeding strategy applied to the wrong target. What elevates moray bites from painful to catastrophic is the presence of a second set of jaws, the pharyngeal jaws, hidden deep within the throat. These jaws are a rare feature among vertebrates, evolved specifically to solve the problem of swallowing prey in confined environments where suction feeding is ineffective. When the moray bites, these secondary jaws launch forward, gripping the prey and dragging it deeper into the mouth, allowing the eel to feed without needing space to maneuver. In the context of a human hand, this mechanism converts a surface bite into a deep, tearing injury as flesh is pulled inward and shredded along the path of withdrawal. The wounds left by moray bites are typically ragged rather than clean, with torn tissue, irregular edges, and significant bleeding. The backward-facing teeth rip through skin and muscle, and the force required to pull free often exacerbates the damage, as resistance causes additional tearing. Blood loss can be immediate and dramatic, especially in shallow water where pressure does not slow bleeding, and the visual shock of seeing one's own blood clouding the water often compounds panic. Even after the hand is freed, the injury rarely stabilizes on its own, because the nature of the wound predisposes it to infection and poor healing. Moray eels carry a diverse community of bacteria in their mouths, a natural consequence of their diet and habitat, and while the eel itself is protected by its mucus and immune adaptations, human tissue is not. Bacteria introduced deep into torn muscle and tendon can proliferate rapidly, leading to infections that progress beyond surface redness into abscesses, tissue necrosis, and systemic illness if not treated promptly. Surgical intervention is often required to clean and repair moray bite wounds, particularly when tendons, nerves, or joints are involved, transforming what began as a momentary grab for balance into a prolonged medical ordeal. The locations where these injuries occur are telling, because they are rarely associated with recklessness or thrill-seeking, but with ordinary reef navigation. Reef walls invite proximity because they offer reference points in moving water, and boulder fields create natural pathways through otherwise difficult terrain. In surge conditions, holding onto rock can feel safer than drifting, and divers are often taught to stabilize themselves gently on dead substrate when necessary. The problem arises when the distinction between dead and occupied space is unclear, and in reef environments that distinction is often invisible until contact is made. Morays exacerbate this risk by selecting the very holes that look most useful to human hands, deep cavities with solid edges that suggest structural integrity. These holes are attractive because they are also attractive to the eel, offering protection, ambush potential, and stable water flow. The overlap is not coincidence, but convergence, with both species selecting the same features for different reasons. The reef does not prioritize human safety, and the moray does not recognize human intent, leaving the burden of awareness entirely on the person reaching into the hole. The irony of moray behavior lies in how predictable it is, because bites are not random or aggressive acts, but the result of a simple sensory misinterpretation applied consistently. When a hand enters a crevice, the eel does not see a person, but experiences a sudden intrusion into a confined space, accompanied by unfamiliar scent and movement. In evolutionary terms, this combination has always meant food or danger, and the correct response has always been to bite decisively. That this response now injures humans is not a flaw in the eel's behavior, but a mismatch between ancient instincts and modern recreational use of reefs. Morays also exhibit strong sight fidelity, often occupying the same hole for extended periods, sometimes months or even years, which means that once a hazardous handhold exists, it remains hazardous long-term. Divers returning to the same site may unknowingly repeat the same mistake, assuming familiarity equates to safety, only to encounter the same resident eel defending its shelter as it always has. This consistency reinforces the importance of understanding reef structure as living architecture rather than static geology, where occupants matter as much as shape. From an ecological perspective, moray eels play a crucial role in controlling populations of reef fish and invertebrates, particularly species that shelter in crevices and would otherwise be difficult for larger predators to access. Their presence influences the behavior of prey species, shaping movement patterns and shelter use across the reef, and contributing to the complex balance that maintains reef diversity. The same adaptations that make them effective predators in this system also make them hazardous to careless hands, illustrating how ecological success often comes with unintended human consequences. There is a subtle but important distinction between fear and respect in these encounters, because morays are not aggressive animals roaming the reef in search of conflict. They do not chase divers, nor do they bite unprovoked in open water, and most encounters occur entirely without incident. The danger arises only when human behavior intersects with the eel's defensive feeding logic, particularly in confined spaces where escape is impossible for either party. Recognizing this distinction allows for safer coexistence, grounded in awareness rather than avoidance. The lesson embedded in moray injuries is not that reefs are hostile, but that they are occupied, layered, and governed by rules that do not account for human convenience. A hole in the reef is never empty by default, and a handhold is never neutral until it is visually confirmed from a safe distance. This principle extends beyond morays to countless other reef inhabitants, but the moray's combination of poor backward vision, powerful bite, and secondary jaws makes it one of the most unforgiving enforcers of this rule. By the time a hand withdraws bleeding from a reef wall, the interaction has already escalated beyond education into consequence, and the reef remains unchanged, indifferent to the exchange. The moray retreats deeper into its hole, resuming its quiet watch, while the injured person carries the memory and the wound away from the site. In this sense, the moray eel becomes a symbol of the reef's refusal to accommodate human assumptions, reminding us that stability must be found through distance and observation rather than contact. In the end, fangs in the handhold are not a freak occurrence, but a predictable outcome of reaching into a world designed for teeth, confinement, and decisive action. The reef does not forgive mistakes gently, and the moray eel does not negotiate boundaries through warning or display. It reacts, efficiently and instinctively, in the only way it ever has. For those who learn to read the reef as living structure rather than empty support, this knowledge becomes protection. Because in environments shaped by millions of years of predation, the safest handhold is often the one never taken. Under jetties and boat platforms, the ocean compresses itself into shadowed corridors where light filters down in broken columns and sound travels differently, dulled by wood, concrete, and the constant slap of water against hulls. These spaces feel separate from the open sea, quieter and more contained, places where people pause rather than swim, sitting on the edge with legs dangling, rinsing masks, cleaning fish, or killing time while waiting for a boat. From above, the water looks calm and predictable, a surface broken only by ripples and reflections. Yet below the line where sunlight fades, the structure becomes a ceiling rather than a boundary, and large predators treat these artificial caverns as ideal habitat. Among the most dominant of these residents are groupers, fish built not for speed or elegance, but for power, patience, and a feeding strategy that turns proximity into capture without warning. Groupers favor jetties and hull shadows for the same reasons smaller fish do, because these structures create shelter, ambush angles, and steady currents that concentrate food. Pilings interrupt water flow, trapping debris and attracting baitfish, while the underside of boats creates a floating reef that moves slowly through the environment, carrying shade and scraps wherever it goes. For a grouper, this is not an accident of human activity, but an opportunity, a predictable source of calories in a world where meals are otherwise earned through effort and risk. Over time, individuals learn the rhythms of these places, recognizing that fish cleaning tables, discarded bait, and casual handouts produce a steady rain of food, and that the same vertical space occupied by scraps is also occupied by bare skin. Unlike predators that stalk or chase, groupers operate through spatial control and overwhelming force applied at close range. Their bodies are massive and thick, with broad heads, wide mouths, and powerful musculature that supports a feeding method known as suction feeding. When a grouper strikes, it does not bite in the conventional sense, but opens its mouth with explosive speed, expanding the buccal cavity so rapidly that water rushes inward, carrying prey along with it. This creates a vacuum effect strong enough to pull fish out of crevices, off the seabed, or away from structures. And because the action happens in a fraction of a second, there is no opportunity for escape once the strike begins. This feeding strategy allows groupers to consume prey nearly as large as their own heads, swallowing fish whole without tearing or chewing. And it is precisely this capability that creates risk in human-dominated spaces. Fingers dangling just below the surface, toes swaying in the water, or hands rinsing gear over the side all occupy the same sensory zone as food scraps, producing movement, vibration, and contrast that trigger feeding responses. The grouper does not analyze these signals visually in the way humans expect, because its strike is guided by motion and pressure changes rather than detailed recognition. And when a stimulus appears within range, the response is automatic. The jaw structure of a grouper reflects this emphasis on engulfment rather than precision, with thick bones, blunt teeth, and a bite force designed to restrain and crush rather than slice. While groupers lack venom or specialized fangs, their jaws are capable of exerting enormous pressure, enough to crack shells, dislocate joints, and fracture bone. When a human hand or foot is caught in this mechanism, the injury is not a puncture, but a compression, with tissue crushed between opposing surfaces and nails torn away as the jaws close. Even brief contact can result in severe damage, because the force involved is far beyond what human anatomy is designed to withstand. The danger is compounded by the environment in which these encounters occur, because jetties and docks restrict movement and delay reaction. A person sitting on the edge cannot easily pull away once a strike begins, and the suddenness of the event often leads to reflexive jerking that worsens injury. Underwater, the grouper may release once it realizes the object is not prey, but by that point the damage is already done, with fingers bruised, bones cracked, and skin torn. In shallow water, bleeding is immediate and visible, turning a casual moment into an emergency within seconds. Groupers that frequent jetties and marinas often display a level of habituation to humans that further increases risk, not because they become aggressive, but because they lose fear. Regular feeding conditions them to associate human presence with food, shortening the distance at which they respond and increasing the likelihood of mistaken strikes. This learning process is subtle and cumulative, unfolding over months or years as individual fish grow larger and more confident, and it illustrates how intelligent, long-lived predators adapt quickly to predictable opportunities. A grouper that once waited at the edge of the shadow now patrols directly beneath dangling legs, positioning itself where the payoff is greatest. From an ecological perspective, this behavior represents a shift rather than a deviation, as groupers are naturally ambush predators that exploit structure and familiarity. In natural reefs, they use caves and overhangs to surprise prey, coordinating strikes with other predators in some cases to flush fish from cover. Artificial structures simply replace coral with concrete and steel, providing similar advantages in a new context. The difference lies in the presence of humans, whose behavior introduces novel stimuli that the grouper interprets through the same sensory framework it uses for prey. The size of groupers amplifies the consequences of these interactions, because many species grow slowly and can reach enormous proportions over decades. Large individuals dominate prime shelter and feeding sites, displacing smaller competitors and asserting control over territory beneath jetties and hulls. Their mass allows them to hold position in currents and surge without expending energy, hovering in shadow like living boulders until something enters range. This stillness contributes to the illusion of safety, because a fish that does not move does not register as a threat, even as it tracks movement above with acute awareness. Stories from coastal communities often describe encounters that unfold without warning, beginning with a splash and ending with injury, before anyone understands what happened. A child kicks the water from a dock and feels a sudden pull on a foot. An angler rinses hands and loses a fingernail in an instant. A swimmer feeding fish is startled by the sheer force of a strike that engulfs more than intended. In most cases, the grouper releases quickly, but the aftermath includes crushed fingers, torn skin, and fractures that require medical attention. These incidents reinforce the reality that even non-venomous animals can cause serious harm when their feeding mechanics intersect with human behavior. The psychological impact of such encounters often exceeds the physical damage, because they violate assumptions about control and familiarity in shallow water. People expect danger to come from open ocean predators, not from the shadows beneath a dock, and this expectation shapes how attention is allocated. Under jetties, eyes look outward toward the horizon rather than downward into shadow, and legs are treated as extensions of the dock rather than vulnerable appendages. Groupers exploit this blind spot not through intent, but through physics, responding to stimuli that cross an invisible threshold. Understanding the grouper's role in these environments requires acknowledging both its ecological importance and the unintended consequences of human interaction. Groupers are key predators in reef systems, regulating populations of smaller fish and maintaining balance within complex food webs. Their presence indicates healthy structure and sufficient prey, and their longevity makes them repositories of local ecological history. When they adapt to artificial habitats, they are not becoming unnatural, but extending their existing strategies into new spaces shaped by human activity. The danger arises when human convenience intersects with this adaptability, particularly in places where feeding is encouraged or tolerated. Handouts may seem harmless or entertaining, but they alter behavior, reducing caution and increasing the likelihood of misinterpretation. A grouper that expects food from above is more likely to strike upward, and in environments where hands and feet occupy that same vertical space, the margin for error disappears. This is not a matter of aggression, but of learned association, where bare skin becomes indistinguishable from bait in the sensory logic of a fish evolved to act quickly. The lesson embedded in these encounters is not that groupers are unpredictable or dangerous by nature, but that their feeding strategy is incompatible with casual contact in confined spaces. The vacuum strike that makes them efficient predators also makes them hazardous neighbors under docks, where the distance between curiosity and injury is measured in centimeters. Respecting this reality means recognizing that jetties and hull shadows are not neutral waiting rooms, but active ecological zones occupied by animals that respond to movement rather than intention. By placing the grouper beneath the jetty, this chapter highlights how human infrastructure reshapes risk rather than eliminating it, concentrating both predators and people into narrow spaces where misunderstandings have immediate consequences. The water may look shallow and calm, but beneath the surface, powerful jaws wait in shadow, responding to signals older than docks, boats, or bait buckets. In these spaces, safety depends not on depth or familiarity, but on awareness of who else is using the structure. In the end, the grouper fish is not a villain lurking under the jetty, but a participant in an ecosystem that now includes human habits as part of its environment. Its suction feeding is not malicious but automatic, a reflex honed to perfection over evolutionary time. When that reflex collides with dangling fingers or bare feet, the outcome feels sudden and unfair. Yet it follows a logic as old as the reef itself. Under the jetty, where shadows gather and food falls from above, the group awaits, not hunting humans but responding to opportunity, reminding anyone who sits at the edge that in the ocean, even still water is never empty. On reef tops at low tide, the ocean feels temporarily subdued, its energy spread thin over wide flats of coral and limestone that lie just beneath a glassy skin of water. These are the places people trust most, where depth seems manageable, where fins scrape lightly against coral heads, and where hands instinctively reach down to steady balance against what looks like solid, immobile structure. The reef here feels exposed and familiar, its complexity flattened by sunlight and shallow depth into something that resembles terrain rather than living architecture. Yet crawling slowly across this surface, almost imperceptibly, is one of the most densely armed animals in the sea, an organism that transforms coral heads into fields of needles and turns casual contact into prolonged suffering without ever displaying aggression or movement that might trigger caution. The crown-of-thorns starfish does not announce itself through color or motion because it does not need to. Its body is broad and many-armed, spreading outward like a biological landmine, each arm covered in long, rigid spines that radiate in all directions. These spines are not decorative or exaggerated, but functional, each one connected to venom glands capable of injecting toxins through the skin with even the slightest pressure. From above, especially in bright, shallow water, the animal blends unnervingly well with the reef, its mottled coloration echoing coral rubble, algae, and shadow. It appears less like an animal than a textured patch of the substrate itself, an extension of the reef rather than an occupant of it. At low tide, crown-of-thorns starfish often move higher onto reef tops, following coral prey into zones that are temporarily exposed or barely submerged. Their movement is slow and methodical, driven by hundreds of tiny tube feet that grip, release, and pull the body forward in waves invisible to casual observation. This pace reinforces the illusion of safety, because animals that move this slowly are rarely perceived as threats, and certainly not as hazards capable of immediate harm. Yet the danger does not lie in speed or pursuit, but in surface area, because wherever the starfish rests, the reef becomes hostile to touch. The spines themselves are the primary interface between the starfish and the outside world, functioning as both armor and weapon. Each spine is brittle and needle-sharp, designed to penetrate skin easily and snap under pressure, leaving fragments embedded deep in tissue. Along their length run grooves connected to venom glands, and when a spine pierces flesh, venom is delivered directly into the wound. This venom is not lethal to humans, but it is potent enough to trigger intense burning pain, swelling, redness, and systemic symptoms such as nausea and dizziness, particularly when multiple spines are involved. The effect is cumulative, meaning that a single spine causes discomfort, but dozens driven into hands or feet can overwhelm the body's ability to localize the response. The scenario plays out repeatedly on shallow reefs around the world, often beginning with a simple miscalculation. A snorkeler pauses to rest on a coral head, placing a hand down for balance without fully submerging the face to inspect the surface. A walker crosses a reef flat at low tide, stepping carefully but trusting that visible coral structure is safe to touch. A diver surfaces in shallow water and braces against the reef while adjusting gear. In each case, contact occurs not with a sharp edge or moving animal, but with a crown-of-thorns starfish occupying the same space, and the result is immediate and unmistakable. Pain flares instantly, sharp and radiating, as spines penetrate skin and break off beneath the surface. Hands recoil reflexively, feet jerk away, but by then, dozens of punctures may already be present, each one a channel for venom and bacteria. The water around the contact point clouds briefly with disturbed sediment and sometimes blood, while the starfish remains unmoved, its spines flexing slightly and then settling back into place. Unlike animals that bite or sting and then retreat, the crown-of-thorns does nothing, because its defense is passive and continuous, activated by contact alone rather than intent. Attempts to remove spines often worsen the situation because the brittle structure of the spines means they fragment easily when grasped or pulled. Pieces remain lodged beneath the skin, where they continue to leach venom and provoke inflammation. The body responds by swelling the affected area, increasing pressure around joints and tendons, and amplifying pain with movement. Fingers stiffen, feet become difficult to bear weight on, and the injury evolves from acute pain into lingering disability that can last days or weeks depending on severity. The situation becomes significantly more dangerous when people attempt to remove crown-of-thorns starfish from reefs using bare hands, a practice that persists in some areas due to their reputation as coral predators. Crown-of-thorns starfish feed by everting their stomachs onto living coral, digesting tissue externally and leaving behind white skeletons, and during population outbreaks, they can devastate reef systems. In response, removal efforts are sometimes undertaken by volunteers or locals without proper protective equipment, leading to repeated and severe envenomations as spines embed across palms, forearms, and fingers. These encounters often involve dozens of spines at once, compounding venom exposure and increasing the risk of infection and prolonged recovery. From a biological perspective, the crown-of-thorns starfish represents an extreme investment in defense rather than escape, a strategy that makes sense for an animal whose survival depends on remaining exposed while feeding. Unlike starfish that hide under rocks or in crevices, crown-of-thorns must traverse open reef surfaces to reach coral prey, making concealment impossible. The solution evolution arrived at was to make the animal effectively untouchable, a moving patch of venomous spikes that discourages predation and accidental contact alike. Fish that attempt to bite or investigate quickly learn to avoid them, and even large predators treat them with caution, reinforcing the effectiveness of this design. The ecological implications of crown-of-thorns outbreaks extend beyond coral loss into human experience because degraded reefs often become more hazardous as starfish populations expand. As coral cover declines, reef tops flatten and become more accessible to wading and snorkeling, increasing human traffic precisely where starfish densities may be highest. This creates a feedback loop in which damaged reefs are not only less biodiverse, but more physically dangerous, altering how people interact with coastal environments and increasing injury rates in areas once considered safe. Venom from crown-of-thorns starfish also interacts with human physiology in ways that complicate healing. The toxins trigger immune responses that can escalate into severe inflammation, and in some individuals, allergic reactions intensify symptoms far beyond the local injury. Swelling can restrict blood flow, numbness may spread, and systemic effects such as fever or nausea can develop, particularly when multiple spines are involved. Secondary infections are a persistent risk, as puncture wounds introduce bacteria from the reef surface into tissue that is already compromised by venom and inflammation. The irony of crown-of-thorns encounters lies in how strongly they contradict human expectations of danger. Starfish are often perceived as harmless, slow-moving, and even decorative, symbols of marine life rather than hazards. This cultural image makes people more likely to touch, lift, or rest on them, assuming that anything without teeth or speed cannot cause serious harm. The crown-of-thorns violates this assumption completely, demonstrating that danger does not require pursuit, intelligence, or aggression, only effective design and the certainty of contact. Understanding this animal requires reframing the reef top not as solid ground, but as a living surface layered with defenses, where stability is temporary and touch carries consequences. Coral heads at low tide may look like convenient platforms, but they are also feeding grounds for organisms that evolved to occupy exposed space without fear. The thin layer of water that covers these reefs hides depth and motion, making it difficult to see spines until they are already embedded, and turning balance into a calculated risk rather than a given. From an evolutionary standpoint, the crown-of-thorns starfish is a reminder that marine hazards often scale with abundance rather than rarity. A single venomous fish may be avoided easily, but a field of spines spread across meters of reef cannot be sidestepped without awareness and care. This abundance transforms entire reef flats into minefields, where danger is not localized but distributed, forcing humans to adapt behavior rather than rely on avoidance. The long-term consequences of crown of thorns injuries often outlast the initial encounter, as retained spine fragments dissolve slowly under the skin, provoking intermittent pain and inflammation. Joints become stiff, grip strength weakens, and walking may remain uncomfortable for weeks, particularly when spines lodge near tendons. In some cases, surgical removal is required to extract deeply embedded fragments, turning a moment of rest or curiosity into a prolonged medical issue. The lesson carried by crown of thorns starfish is not about fear, but about awareness of scale and surface. The reef top is not a bench or a handrail, and animals that move slowly are not necessarily safe to touch. In shallow water, where confidence replaces caution and visibility feels complete, danger often resides exactly where hands and feet seek support. The starfish does not chase or strike, but waits, its spines raised not in threat but in constant readiness, enforcing boundaries through pain rather than motion. In the end, the crown of thorns starfish transforms the reef top into a biological warning sign written not in color or sound, but in structure and chemistry. It reminds us that ecosystems defend themselves not only through predators and toxins, but through geometry, abundance, and persistence. On shallow coral flats, where water barely covers life and the line between land and sea blurs, the crown of thorns waits beneath the surface, its spines catching light and skin alike, teaching through experience that the reef is alive everywhere, even where it feels most solid underfoot. On reef tops where the water thins to a wavering lens and sunlight presses hard against stone and coral, the ocean takes on a deceptive softness. Color concentrates here, pooling in bright patches where algae glow green, coral skeletons bleach pale, and sea anemones spread themselves like living cushions across the substrate. These are the zones where snorkelers slow down, where divers surface and kneel to regain breath, where photographers settle into position and tourists lower themselves carefully, trusting their knees and hands to whatever looks gentle enough to support them. In this shallow, illuminated world, danger does not look sharp or aggressive because it does not need to. It looks inviting, pliable, and decorative, and it waits in silence for skin to make contact. Sea anemones occupy this space perfectly, neither hiding nor fleeing, but presenting themselves openly as soft, flower-like forms that sway slightly with the movement of water. Their tentacles ripple and contract, responding to currents and shadows, and their colors range from muted browns to electric greens, purples, and reds that stand out vividly against the reef. To human eyes, trained to associate softness with safety and color with beauty, an anemone looks like a natural resting pad, something to touch, kneel on, or brush aside without consequence. This assumption is understandable because the anemone does not harden, spike, or withdraw when approached, and its stillness reads as permission rather than warning. What this appearance conceals is a dense forest of microscopic weapons, each tentacle armed with thousands of stinging cells known as nematocysts, structures so small and so fast that they operate beyond conscious perception. These cells are among the most specialized biological mechanisms in the animal kingdom, functioning like spring-loaded harpoons coiled under tension. When triggered by contact or chemical cues, they fire instantly, ejecting barbed threads tipped with venom into whatever has touched them. The speed of this discharge is extraordinary, occurring in a fraction of the time it takes a nerve impulse to travel, meaning the body reacts only after the damage is already done. For prey, this system is devastatingly effective, immobilizing small fish and plankton that brush against the anemone's tentacles and allowing the animal to draw them inward toward its central mouth. For humans, the effect is not paralysis, but irritation, pain, and inflammation that can escalate depending on exposure and individual sensitivity. Bare skin pressed against an anemone triggers thousands of stings simultaneously, each one microscopic, but together forming a coordinated assault that overwhelms the skin's defenses. The result is often an immediate burning or itching sensation, followed by redness, swelling, and raised welts that mirror the shape of the tentacles themselves. These reactions vary widely because human immune systems interpret the venom differently, and sensitive areas such as knees, inner arms, and fingers are particularly vulnerable. In some individuals, the response remains localized, a painful but temporary reminder that contact occurred. In others, especially those with allergies or repeated exposure, the reaction can intensify, spreading beyond the contact site and producing symptoms that include hives, nausea, or difficulty breathing. The anemone does not adjust its response based on the size or intent of what touches it, because its stinging mechanism evolved to be indiscriminate, optimized for prey capture and defense rather than threat assessment. The danger of sea anemones increases on reef tops precisely because these environments encourage contact. Shallow water reduces buoyancy, making kneeling or standing feel necessary for balance. Waves surge unpredictably, pushing bodies downward at the worst moments, and photographers often settle low to stabilize shots or frame colorful subjects. In these scenarios, hands and knees become points of contact, and anemones positioned at convenient heights or flat surfaces become accidental targets. The softness that seems reassuring becomes a liability, because it allows deeper contact, increasing the surface area exposed to stinging cells and amplifying the reaction. Sea anemones are not passive decorations of the reef, but active participants in complex ecological relationships that shape where they live and how they interact with other organisms. They anchor themselves firmly to rock and coral, choosing positions with optimal light, water flow, and access to food, and once established, they can persist for decades. Their bodies are flexible but strong, capable of retracting partially during extreme conditions, yet they rarely withdraw completely, relying instead on chemical defense to discourage interference. This persistence means that anemones occupy the same spots year after year, becoming permanent fixtures of the reef-top landscape. One of the most famous relationships in the reef involves anemones and clownfish, a symbiosis that has profoundly shaped human perception of both animals. Clownfish live among anemone tentacles, immune to their stings due to a protective mucus layer that prevents nematocysts from firing. In exchange, clownfish defend the anemone from predators, bring food scraps, and improve water circulation around the tentacles through constant movement. This partnership creates a visual focal point on the reef, a cluster of bright fish darting in and out of a colorful anemone, drawing attention and curiosity from snorkelers and divers alike. Where clownfish live, anemones are guaranteed, and where anemones are, a living carpet of stingers extends far beyond the visible fish. The presence of clownfish often lowers human caution, because the scene reads as familiar and friendly, reinforced by cultural imagery that portrays these animals as harmless and approachable. People kneel nearby for photos, reach out to steady themselves, or attempt to touch the fish, unaware that the anemone's tentacles extend farther than expected, and that contact with skin lacking protective mucus will trigger immediate defense. The irony is sharp, because the same relationship that protects the clownfish makes the anemone especially hazardous to unprotected humans. The microscopic nature of anemone stings contributes to underestimation of risk, because there is no single point of injury to focus on, no visible spine or puncture to explain the pain. Instead, the skin reacts across a broad area, and symptoms can continue to intensify even after contact has ended. Saltwater rinsing does little to neutralize the venom, and rubbing the area can worsen the reaction by breaking unfired nematocysts and triggering additional discharges. Vinegar or other acidic solutions are sometimes recommended depending on species, but the effectiveness varies and improper treatment can exacerbate symptoms. Beyond immediate pain, anemone stings can leave lasting marks, particularly in individuals with sensitive skin or repeated exposure. Hyperpigmentation, scarring, and prolonged sensitivity can persist for weeks or months, turning what seemed like a minor incident into a lingering reminder. In rare cases, severe allergic reactions require medical intervention, and even moderate reactions can interfere with movement, making walking, swimming, or kneeling uncomfortable long after leaving the water. These outcomes highlight the mismatch between appearance and impact, because few people expect soft organisms to leave such enduring effects. Ecologically, anemones play a vital role in reef systems, acting as both predators and habitat providers. They control populations of small fish and planktonic organisms while offering shelter to symbiotic partners, and their presence influences local biodiversity by creating microhabitats that attract specific species. Their chemical defenses allow them to occupy exposed positions without fear of predation, contributing to the layered complexity of reef surfaces. In this sense, anemones exemplify how chemical weaponry can replace physical armor or speed, allowing an organism to thrive openly rather than hiding. The risk to humans arises not because anemones are aggressive, but because their ecological success depends on remaining exposed and reactive to touch. They cannot flee or relocate when disturbed, so their defense must be automatic and absolute. This design works exceptionally well against natural predators and competitors, but it creates problems when human bodies enter the same space with different expectations. Knees and hands are not prey, but they trigger the same response, and the anemone cannot distinguish between accidental contact and deliberate attack. The reef top amplifies this interaction by compressing space, forcing humans to interact physically with the environment rather than floating above it. In deeper water, buoyancy creates separation, but in shallow zones, gravity returns and contact becomes inevitable. Anemones positioned on flat surfaces or low ledges become unavoidable hazards, especially during low tide or surge conditions when movement is unpredictable. The thin layer of water disguises tentacle movement, making it difficult to judge where the anemone begins and ends until skin has already crossed the boundary. Understanding sea anemones as soft traps rather than benign ornaments requires a shift in how reef tops are navigated, emphasizing distance, buoyancy, and observation over contact. The safest interaction with an anemone is visual, appreciating its color and motion without attempting to test its texture. This approach aligns with ecological respect, minimizing stress to the animal while protecting the human from unnecessary injury. It also reinforces a broader lesson about shallow marine environments, which is that softness does not equal safety, and beauty does not imply permission. The cultural framing of reef life often emphasizes friendliness and accessibility, encouraging touch and interaction in ways that conflict with the realities of animal defense. Anemones challenge this narrative by demonstrating that even the most inviting organisms enforce boundaries through mechanisms invisible to the naked eye. Their stings are not dramatic or cinematic, but persistent and uncomfortable, teaching caution through delayed consequence rather than immediate shock. In connecting anemones to clownfish territory, the reef reveals another layer of irony, because the very scenes people seek out for comfort and nostalgia are among the most biologically armed. The safe haven for one species is a minefield for another, and understanding this distinction is essential for moving safely through shared spaces. The anemone does not care who touches it or why, because its survival depends on consistency rather than discernment. In the end, sea anemones embody a quiet truth about reef ecosystems, which is that danger often presents itself in the language of comfort. Softness invites touch, color invites proximity, and stillness invites trust. Yet beneath these signals lies a system evolved to punish contact decisively. On reef tops, where knees rest and hands reach without thought, the anemone waits not as a predator, but as a boundary, enforcing separation through chemistry and reminding us that in the ocean, even the gentlest surfaces can sting when crossed. The continental shelf looks empty only to eyes trained to scan for movement, color, or the reassuring outline of fins and scales drifting through open water, because the shelf is not an arena for obvious motion, but a landscape of patience where life survives by becoming invisible, and nowhere is this philosophy carried to a more unsettling extreme than in the monkfish, an animal that does not hunt by chasing or stalking, but by transforming itself into a piece of the seafloor and waiting for the world to make a mistake. From above, the bottom appears as a plain of sand rippled by currents, broken occasionally by stones, shells, and the low relief of worm burrows and crab tracks. Yet embedded within that texture lies a mouth so large and so still that it resembles a geological feature rather than a living thing. An open cavity rimmed with teeth that curve inward like rusted fishhooks, positioned not to bite, but to prevent escape once the boundary between safety and death has already been crossed. The monkfish does not need to move, because movement is information, and information warns prey. So it chooses instead to erase itself, pressing its flattened body into the sediment until only the essential components remain visible, the lure twitching like a loose thread, and the teeth gleaming faintly beneath a thin veil of sand. This animal's shape seems almost designed to offend expectations of what a fish should be, with a body compressed from top to bottom, skin textured and mottled to match the surrounding seabed, and a head that dominates its proportions to an absurd degree, because for the monkfish, the mouth is not merely a feeding tool, but the entire strategy, the defining feature around which every other adaptation revolves. The eyes sit high and forward, allowing it to watch the space above the sand without lifting its body, while the pectoral fins splay outward like limbs rather than fins, stabilizing the fish as it settles into its chosen patch of bottom and preventing currents from exposing its outline. Over time, fine grains of sand drift down and cling to its skin, further blurring the boundary between animal and environment, until even experienced observers can stare directly at a monkfish and fail to recognize it as alive, mistaking it for a shadow or a darker patch of sediment that does not merit further attention. What gives the monkfish away, if anything does, is the lure, a modified spine extending from the head that ends in a fleshy tip capable of subtle movement. And this small, seemingly insignificant appendage is enough to rewrite the fate of anything curious, hungry, or careless enough to investigate. The lure does not glow with light in the shallow shelf waters the way deep sea. Anglerfish use bioluminescence, but it moves with an uncanny realism, twitching and drifting in a way that mimics worms, small fish or drifting organic debris, exploiting the fact that many bottom-dwelling creatures are conditioned to investigate motion in an otherwise static environment. Crabs scuttle closer, their sensory world tuned to vibrations and chemical cues. Small fish descend from the water column to inspect what looks like an easy meal resting on the sand, and even seabirds diving for prey can be drawn dangerously close when the lure catches their attention near the surface of the bottom, because the monkfish does not discriminate between categories of prey so much as between objects that fit within the physical limits of its mouth and those that do not. The strike, when it happens, is not a lunge in the conventional sense but a collapse of space, a sudden opening of the jaws so rapid and so forceful that the surrounding water rushes inward, dragging the prey along with it in a brief, violent vacuum that leaves no opportunity for reaction. This suction-feeding mechanism is one of the most extreme among fishes, relying on a rapid expansion of the buccal cavity that drops pressure inside the mouth and pulls water, sediment, and prey inward as a single mass. And because the monkfish's mouth is disproportionately large relative to its body, the volume of water displaced during this expansion is enormous. The teeth, angled backward, do not cut or tear but act as a one-way gate, ensuring that anything drawn inside cannot be expelled even if it struggles. And within moments the jaws close, the vacuum collapses, and the seabed returns to stillness, as though nothing has happened, leaving behind only a faint disturbance in the sand where an animal once existed. This feeding strategy allows the monkfish to consume prey nearly as large as itself, a feat that would be impossible for predators reliant on pursuit or repeated bites, because the energy cost of chasing prey across the seabed is high and success is uncertain in an environment where visibility is often limited by suspended sediment. Instead, the monkfish invests in patience, sometimes remaining motionless for hours or days, conserving energy in a landscape where meals are unpredictable and opportunities may be separated by long intervals of waiting. The ability to swallow large prey whole reduces the frequency with which the animal must hunt, a critical advantage on the continental shelf where food availability can fluctuate with seasons, currents, and human activity, and where the cost of failure is not merely hunger, but exposure, because a moving monkfish is a visible monkfish, and visibility invites its own risks from larger predators and from fishing gear that sweeps indiscriminately across the bottom. The continental shelf itself is a deceptive environment, often described as a desert compared to coral reefs or kelp forests. Yet this apparent emptiness is precisely what makes ambush strategies so effective, because prey species evolve under the assumption that danger announces itself through motion or silhouette, not through absence. In this setting, the monkfish represents a kind of ecological trap, exploiting the cognitive shortcuts of other animals that equate stillness with safety. And its success reveals an important truth about benthic ecosystems, which is that survival often depends less on speed or strength than on the ability to manipulate perception. The shelf is full of animals that bury themselves, flatten themselves, or disguise themselves as rocks and plants. But the monkfish takes this to a level that feels almost predatory toward the observer, as though the environment itself has grown a mouth and learned how to wait. This strategy also explains why encounters between humans and monkfish can be so unsettling, because divers, waders, and fishermen often rely on visual scanning to assess risk, and the monkfish defeats that method entirely. Feet step where eyes have already looked and found nothing. Fins brush past what appears to be empty sand, and only when the animal moves or opens its mouth does the illusion break, revealing that the seafloor was never empty at all. While monkfish are not aggressive toward humans, their size and the sheer scale of their mouths can create moments of shock when accidentally disturbed. These encounters serve as a reminder that the continental shelf is not a passive stage, but an active participant in the lives and deaths that unfold upon it, filled with organisms that blur the line between habitat and hunter. From a physiological perspective, the monkfish's design reflects a deep commitment to this ambush lifestyle, with muscles and skeletal structures optimized for rapid jaw expansion rather than sustained swimming, and a metabolism that supports long periods of inactivity, punctuated by brief bursts of extreme performance. The skin is thick and often covered in mucus, protecting it from abrasion as it lies partially buried and reducing friction when sand shifts around its body, while the coloration varies subtly across individuals and habitats, allowing populations to match local sediment types with remarkable precision. Even the placement of sensory organs reflects the need to monitor the space above and ahead without moving, enabling the fish to detect vibrations and pressure changes caused by approaching prey long before visual contact is made. The presence of monkfish on the continental shelf also influences the behavior of other species, shaping patterns of movement and foraging in ways that are easy to overlook, because the predator itself remains hidden. Small fish learn to avoid certain textures or microhabitats. Crabs alter their routes across the sand, and the distribution of prey species can shift in response to areas where ambush predators are more common, creating a patchwork of risk across what appears to be a uniform landscape. In this way, the monkfish contributes to the structure of the benthic community not through dominance or abundance, but through the quiet pressure of unseen threat, reinforcing the idea that ecosystems are governed as much by fear as by consumption. What makes the monkfish particularly effective and particularly disturbing is that its strategy relies on the assumption that the seabed is inert, an assumption shared not only by prey but by humans who think of danger as something that approaches rather than something that waits. The continental shelf invites this misunderstanding because its dangers do not advertise themselves with color or movement, and because the scale of the environment encourages the belief that there is space to react, space to escape, and space to see what is coming. The monkfish undermines all of this by collapsing distance to zero in an instant, demonstrating that in some ecosystems, the most dangerous thing is not what moves fastest, but what remains perfectly still. In presenting the monkfish as an introduction to the hidden violence of the seabed, it becomes clear that the shelf is less a plain and more a field of traps, each adapted to exploit a different sensory blind spot, and that survival in this environment depends on an awareness that extends beyond sight into an understanding of how absence itself can signal presence. The monkfish does not chase, threaten, or warn because it does not need to, and its success lies in the fact that by the time its existence is revealed, the outcome is already decided. Beneath the calm surface of the continental shelf, mouths wait in the sand, patient and prepared, reminding us that emptiness in nature is often an illusion, and that the line between ground and predator can be thinner than a single layer of drifting sediment. At the edge of a tropical river mouth, where fresh water loosens its grip and salt pushes inland with the tide, the landscape feels deceptively gentle, shaped by mud rather than rock, and softened by mangroves whose roots knit the shoreline together like exposed veins. The water here is shallow enough to wade, often no deeper than a human knee near the bank, and its surface reflects the sky in dull bronze tones at dusk, broken only by drifting leaves and the slow swirl of tidal currents. This is the place where people feel safest entering the water, where the absence of waves and the closeness of land create an illusion of control, and where daily life unfolds at the boundary between river and sea, through fishing, washing, gathering shellfish, or simply cooling off at the end of a hot day. Yet beneath this calm surface lies one of the most precise ambush systems on Earth, embodied by the saltwater crocodile, an animal whose entire existence revolves around exploiting the human tendency to underestimate stillness, shallow water, and edges. The saltwater crocodile does not announce itself because it does not need to, and its preferred hunting ground is not the open river channel, but the narrow zone where land and water blur, where silhouettes pass close enough to touch the surface and vibrations travel cleanly through mud and water alike. In these brackish channels and mangrove creeks, the crocodile positions itself parallel to the bank, body aligned with the shoreline rather than pointing outward, reducing its profile and allowing it to remain half concealed by water and shadow. Only the eyes and nostrils break the surface, set high on the skull so the animal can breathe and watch, while the rest of its body remains invisible, supported by buoyancy and anchored by slow, minimal movements of its tail that leave no obvious wake. The crocodile is not sleeping here, despite how it appears, because this posture represents a state of heightened sensory readiness, a living trap calibrated to detect the smallest disturbance at the water's edge. Vision plays a role in this ambush, but it is only part of a larger sensory network that allows the crocodile to interpret its environment with unsettling precision. The animal's eyes are adapted for low light, optimized for the crepuscular hours of dusk and dawn, when many human activities coincide with peak crocodile activity, and they track contrast rather than detail, locking onto the dark shape of legs against lighter sky or water. At the same time, specialized pressure receptors embedded in the crocodile's skin, particularly around the jaws, detect minute changes in water displacement, translating ripples and vibrations into spatial information about movement, size, and distance. A foot entering the water sends a distinct signal through the shallow channel, a pattern of waves that the crocodile can distinguish from drifting debris or swimming fish. And this sensory integration allows the animal to judge when a potential target has moved close enough for the strike to succeed. The reason knee-deep water is so dangerous in these environments is not because it restricts movement, but because it creates the perfect geometry for attack, positioning a human body close enough to the crocodile's mouth that a single explosive motion can secure a grip before any reaction is possible. When the crocodile launches, it does not rise slowly or lunge visibly, but surges forward with a burst of power driven by the tail, jaws snapping shut around a limb or torso in a fraction of a second. The force of the bite alone is catastrophic, generated by muscles that have evolved to crush bone and hold struggling prey, but the initial grab is only the beginning of a sequence that turns proximity into inevitability. Once contact is made, the crocodile immediately uses its mass and leverage to pull the victim off balance, dragging them into deeper water where footing disappears and resistance becomes chaotic. It is here that the death roll begins, a behavior so iconic that it has become synonymous with crocodiles, yet its effectiveness is often misunderstood as brute violence rather than biomechanical precision. The roll is not a wild spin, but a controlled rotation around the animal's longitudinal axis, using the tail and trunk muscles to twist the body while maintaining a firm grip with the jaws. This motion tears flesh, dislocates joints, and overwhelms the victim's ability to orient themselves in water, rapidly converting struggle into disorganization and panic. In shallow channels near the bank, even a single rotation can be enough to break bones or sever limbs. And when combined with submersion, the roll accelerates exhaustion and drowning, ending the encounter with chilling efficiency. What makes these attacks particularly lethal is that they occur in spaces humans perceive as transitional rather than dangerous, places associated with routine rather than risk, where vigilance relaxes and attention drifts toward tasks rather than surroundings. Mangrove edges and river mouths feel familiar and domestic compared to open water, yet from the crocodile's perspective, they are ideal hunting grounds, structured to funnel movement along predictable paths and to limit escape routes. The tangle of roots restricts lateral movement, the soft substrate slows running or retreat, and the water depth prevents effective resistance while still allowing the crocodile to remain concealed. Over generations, saltwater crocodiles have refined their use of these environments, learning not just where prey appears, but how it behaves, when it arrives, and how close it is willing to approach the edge. The crocodile's apparent stillness during these waits reflects an energy strategy shaped by the demands of ambush predation in warm environments, where overheating and unnecessary movement can be costly. As ectotherms, crocodiles rely on external heat sources to regulate body temperature, and brackish shallows provide a thermal gradient that allows them to remain within an optimal range while conserving energy. By resting motionless in water, warmed by the day's sun or cooled by tidal exchange, they minimize metabolic expenditure, storing energy for the brief, violent exertion of an attack. This balance between inactivity and explosive power defines the crocodile's hunting style, enabling individuals to survive long periods without feeding while remaining capable of delivering overwhelming force when an opportunity arises. The timing of these attacks is rarely random, clustering around dusk and night when human visibility decreases and sensory reliance shifts from sight to sound and touch, domains where crocodiles hold the advantage. As light fades, reflections and shadows multiply on the water's surface, blurring depth perception and making it harder to detect subtle anomalies, like the outline of eyes or the slight disturbance caused by a submerged body. At the same time, sounds carry farther in calm evening air, and vibrations from footsteps or splashing become clearer signals against the quieter background, effectively announcing presence to any crocodile waiting nearby. This convergence of reduced human awareness and heightened crocodile efficiency transforms ordinary activities into high-risk moments, where a single step too close to the edge can close the distance between land and predator instantly. From an ecological standpoint, saltwater crocodiles occupy a unique position as both apex predators and ecosystem engineers within these brackish systems, influencing not only prey populations, but also the behavior and distribution of other species. Their presence shapes where animals drink, cross, or feed, creating zones of avoidance that ripple through the food web and alter patterns of movement along the shoreline. Fish and crustaceans adjust their use of shallow margins. Birds learn to approach water with caution, and even large mammals change crossing points to reduce exposure, demonstrating how a single predator can impose structure on an entire landscape through the threat of ambush alone. This ecological role reinforces the crocodile's reliance on edges and boundaries, where control over access to water translates into control over life and death. Human interactions with saltwater crocodiles often focus on the drama of attacks, but the underlying reality is a long history of coexistence shaped by geography, tradition, and changing land use. In many regions, people have learned to interpret subtle signs of crocodile presence, such as slide marks on mud, patterns of floating vegetation, or the absence of smaller animals near the bank, and these cues inform decisions about where and when to enter the water. However, as human populations expand and activities intensify along river mouths and mangrove systems, the margin for error narrows, and the crocodile's ancient strategies intersect more frequently with modern routines that lack inherited caution. The result is not a change in crocodile behavior, but an increase in situations where human assumptions about safety collide with a predator that has never needed to adapt to us. Understanding the crocodile as an ambush predator of the edge reframes these encounters not as aberrations, but as predictable outcomes of overlapping space use. Where an animal optimized for patience meets a species inclined toward routine. The crocodile does not chase humans, nor does it seek confrontation, because its strategy depends on proximity rather than pursuit, and its success lies in remaining unnoticed until movement brings prey within reach. Every step taken at the water's edge, every foot placed into knee-deep shallows, becomes a negotiation with an animal that has spent millions of years perfecting the art of waiting just out of sight. In these brackish river mouths and mangrove channels, the danger is not hidden far away. but positioned exactly where people feel most secure, demonstrating that in predator-dominated ecosystems, the boundary between safety and catastrophe can be measured in the length of a single stride. By placing viewers at this edge, where land dissolves into water and routine dissolves into risk, the saltwater crocodile reveals a broader truth about survival in shared environments, which is that danger often resides not in dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet overlap between daily life and ancient instinct. The step too close to the edge is rarely dramatic in the moment it is taken, yet it aligns perfectly with a predator designed to exploit that final meter of distance, turning still water into a lethal extension of its jaws. In understanding this dynamic, the crocodile becomes less a monster and more a reminder that ecosystems operate according to rules older than human presence, and that respect for those rules begins with recognizing that edges are never neutral ground. In shallow bays, where the water thins to ankle or knee depth and the horizon feels close enough to touch, the ocean presents itself as gentle and negotiable. These are the places families wade without masks, where fishermen push small boats off sandbars, and where travelers step barefoot into water that looks clear, warm, and empty. The bottom appears smooth and pale, broken only by ripples of light and faint trails left by crabs or drifting algae, and the illusion of safety is reinforced by how visible everything seems. Yet beneath that thin veneer of sand, the seabed is not inert, and some of its most dangerous inhabitants are defined precisely by how completely they disappear. Stingrays are masters of this disappearance, animals shaped by evolution to become the sand itself when still. Their bodies are flattened into wide, flexible discs that press flush against the seabed, while rhythmic movements of their fins draw sand up and over their backs until only the faint outline of eyes and spiracles remain exposed. From above, even at close range, a resting stingray is nearly indistinguishable from the bottom, its coloration matching the surrounding sediment with unsettling accuracy. This camouflage is not decorative, but defensive, allowing the ray to rest in open, shallow water without advertising its presence to predators or competitors. For stingrays, these shallow bays are ideal resting grounds, offering warmth, abundant oxygen, and access to prey hidden just beneath the sand. Rays feed on buried clams, worms, and crustaceans, using electroreception to detect the faint electrical signals produced by living tissue beneath the substrate. This sensory system allows them to hunt without sight, gliding slowly over the bottom until a target is detected, then pinning prey beneath their disc before extracting it with crushing jaws. When not feeding, rays settle back into the sand to rest, conserving energy while remaining alert to changes in pressure and vibration above. It is precisely this alertness that defines the danger of stingray encounters, because the ray's primary defense is not aggression, but reflex. Stingrays do not attack unprovoked, nor do they chase or seek out humans, but when stepped on or cornered, their response is automatic and violent. The tail, normally trailing behind the body, snaps upward in a powerful arc, driven by muscular force refined to deliver a single decisive motion. At the base of this tail sits the barb, a serrated spine coated in venomous tissue, positioned perfectly to strike upward into whatever has made contact with the ray's body. The mechanics of this defense are brutally efficient, because the barb is designed not to pierce cleanly, but to tear and lodge. Its edges are backward-facing, like saw teeth, ensuring that once it penetrates flesh, removal causes additional damage. The venom coating the spine enters the wound immediately, triggering intense pain and disrupting tissue at the site of injury. This response evolved to deter large predators such as sharks, delivering a message that contact comes at a high cost, and it works just as effectively against human legs and feet. In shallow bays, the conditions for these encounters are almost perfect, because visibility encourages confidence while depth encourages contact. People wade rather than swim, planting feet firmly into the sand and standing still to talk, fish, or admire the view. Each step compresses the substrate, sending pressure waves outward and downward, signals that a buried ray detects instantly. If the step lands directly on the ray's disc, the response is immediate, the tail lashing upward faster than conscious thought, and the injury occurs before the person even realizes what they have stepped on. The resulting wounds are severe not only because of venom, but because of the depth and nature of penetration. The barb can drive deep into ankles, calves, or the tops of feet, puncturing muscle and sometimes striking tendons or blood vessels. In extreme cases, it can penetrate joints or lodge near bone, complicating removal and healing. Bleeding is often heavy, as the serrated edges tear tissue, and the pain is described consistently as overwhelming, radiating outward from the wound and intensifying rapidly. Venom from stingrays is not typically fatal, but it is physiologically disruptive, containing compounds that cause intense pain, muscle cramping, nausea, and in some cases cardiovascular effects. The pain alone can incapacitate a person, making it difficult to move or remain upright in water, which introduces additional risk of drowning if assistance is not immediate. Swelling follows quickly, and the area around the wound becomes rigid and hypersensitive, limiting mobility for hours or days after the incident. One of the most dangerous aspects of stingray injuries is the instinctive response to pull away, because withdrawing the barb can worsen tissue damage if done improperly. The serrations catch on flesh, tearing as the spine is removed, and fragments of the venomous sheath can remain embedded in the wound. Infections are a serious concern, because the barb introduces bacteria from the marine environment deep into tissue, creating conditions where pathogens can thrive. Medical treatment often involves thorough cleaning, pain management, and in some cases surgical intervention to remove retained fragments and repair damaged structures. The classic advice given in stingray country is deceptively simple, yet grounded in an understanding of ray behavior and sensory perception. Rather than stepping normally, people are encouraged to shuffle their feet along the bottom, sliding rather than lifting, creating vibrations that alert rays to approaching movement without applying sudden pressure. This gives resting rays time to detect the disturbance and swim away, lifting off the sand and revealing themselves briefly before settling elsewhere. The shuffle step works not because it avoids rays, but because it communicates presence in a language the ray understands. Standing still in shallow water, by contrast, is one of the most dangerous behaviors in ray habitat because it removes the warning signals that movement provides. A ray may approach and settle near a stationary person, mistaking the absence of vibration for safety, only to be startled when the person eventually shifts weight or takes a step. In this scenario, the ray's response is again reflexive, and the injury occurs not because the ray was hidden, but because it misjudged proximity in a shared space. Ecologically, stingrays occupy a critical role in shallow marine systems, regulating populations of benthic invertebrates and influencing sediment dynamics through their feeding behavior. Their foraging pits aerate the substrate, redistributing nutrients and creating microhabitats for other organisms. This constant interaction with the seabed makes shallow bays biologically rich environments, even when they appear empty, and underscores why rays are present in precisely the places humans prefer to wade. The persistence of stingray injuries, despite widespread awareness, speaks to how strongly human perception conflicts with marine reality. Clear water and visible sand create an expectation of emptiness, while depth cues borrowed from land encourage standing and pausing rather than floating. The bay feels like a transition zone rather than habitat, a place between shore and sea where danger should diminish rather than concentrate. Stingrays exploit this misconception not intentionally but structurally, occupying the overlap between human comfort and ecological function. Cultural narratives often frame stingray encounters as freak accidents or dramatic events, overshadowing the everyday biology that makes them predictable. Rays are not aggressive animals, nor do they possess malice or territoriality toward humans. They respond to pressure and threat with the only defense they have, and in environments where stepping is unavoidable, that defense becomes relevant more often than people expect. Understanding this reframes the stingray not as an attacker, but as an animal, enforcing boundaries through reflex rather than choice. The lesson embedded in stingray behavior is one of movement and awareness, emphasizing that safety in shallow water comes from staying dynamic rather than static. Shuffling feet, maintaining gentle motion, and avoiding sudden steps communicate presence to the environment and reduce the likelihood of surprise. These habits align human behavior more closely with the rhythms of the bay, respecting the sensory world of animals that rely on vibration rather than sight. From a broader perspective, stingray encounters illustrate how marine hazards are often rooted in invisibility rather than threat, in animals that hide by becoming the environment rather than standing apart from it. The sand that stabs back is not animated by aggression, but by design, shaped to respond instantly when its surface is breached. This design has served stingrays for millions of years, protecting them from predators far larger and more dangerous than humans, and it continues to function regardless of who steps into its range. In the aftermath of a stingray injury, the bay often looks unchanged, the sand smooth again, the water calm and shallow, betraying nothing of what occurred moments earlier. The ray has already moved on, settling elsewhere beneath a new layer of sand, leaving behind only pain, swelling, and the realization that the seabed was never empty. For those who learn from this experience, the memory becomes a guide, shaping how they move through shallow water in the future. In the end, stingrays are not symbols of danger, but of adaptation, animals perfectly tuned to the interface between sand and sea. Their presence turns shallow bays into places where awareness matters more than depth, and where small changes in behavior can prevent life-altering injury. The sand does not attack, but it does respond. And in ray country, every step carries a conversation between foot and seabed, one best conducted with a shuffle rather than a stomp. On shallow reefs and sandy lagoons where the water feels calm enough to promise safety, green sea turtles drift through the scene like ancient survivors from a gentler world. Their movements are slow and deliberate, their shells rounded and worn smooth by decades of currents and coral contact, and their expressions seem almost contemplative as they glide past divers and snorkelers. People pause when they see them, lowering cameras, slowing their breathing, letting the moment stretch, because turtles do not trigger the same caution as spines, teeth, or venom. They are icons of peace and longevity, animals associated with patience rather than power. And this perception shapes how humans behave around them in ways that quietly increase risk. Green sea turtles use shallow reef systems not as transit corridors alone, but as resting zones essential to their daily energy balance. Despite their size, turtles are air-breathing reptiles, and every dive costs oxygen that must be carefully budgeted. To manage this, they rest frequently, often sleeping under ledges, inside shallow caves, or directly on the sand where water movement is minimal and escape routes feel secure. In these resting states, turtles lower their metabolic rate, slowing heart rate and muscle activity, allowing them to remain submerged for extended periods without surfacing. This physiological strategy is critical to their survival, but it also means that a resting turtle is not alert in the way people expect an animal to be. A sleeping or resting turtle does not track approaching movement visually with the same awareness it would while swimming, because its nervous system is tuned toward conservation rather than vigilance during these phases. Its eyes may be partially closed, its head tucked slightly inward, and its flippers relaxed against the substrate or folded under the shell. To a diver or snorkeler passing through a reef, this stillness reads as accessibility, an invitation to approach closely, peer into the space, or swim through the same ledge or cave where the turtle rests. The environment encourages this behavior, because swim-throughs and overhangs are natural features that attract exploration, promising shelter from surge and dramatic light, contrasts that feel cinematic and safe. The problem arises when these shared spaces are narrow, because turtles are not built to maneuver delicately when startled. Their bodies are massive, with dense shells composed of fused bone and keratin that can weigh hundreds of kilograms in large adults. Their flippers, though graceful in open water, are powerful propulsion tools designed to move that mass efficiently across vast distances. When a turtle is surprised in a confined space, its response is not subtle, because evolution has favored decisive movement over careful negotiation in moments of threat. A turtle trapped against a wall, ceiling, or narrow exit will kick hard, driving its front flippers downward and backward in a forceful motion intended to propel the body forward and upward. This kick is not an attack, but an escape reflex, triggered by sudden proximity, touch, or blocked exit paths. In open water, the movement creates acceleration and distance. In a cave, swim through, or ledge, That same motion transfers force directly into whatever occupies the space behind or beneath the turtle, including a diver's chest, arms, or head. The shell itself becomes a blunt instrument in these moments because its rigidity and mass do not absorb impact the way soft tissue does. When a turtle pivots or lunges forward in panic, the trailing edge of the shell can collide with shoulders, forearms, or faces, while the flippers strike with enough force to dislocate joints or knock a person off balance. In shallow water, where buoyancy is reduced and the reef is close, this loss of balance often results in secondary impacts, as the person is pushed into coral, rock, or cave walls with little ability to recover position smoothly. These incidents are rarely anticipated, because turtles do not look dangerous even when close, and their calm demeanor encourages proximity. Divers may hover directly above a resting turtle, inadvertently blocking its primary escape route, while snorkelers may approach from behind without realizing how limited the turtle's backward awareness is. When the turtle finally reacts, the movement is sudden and forceful, and the person involved has little time to protect themselves or create distance. Green sea turtles evolved this powerful escape response because hesitation is costly in environments filled with predators. Historically, large sharks posed a serious threat, and a delayed response could mean fatal injury. As a result, turtles rely on immediate, explosive movement rather than gradual retreat when startled, prioritizing survival over precision. This instinct has not changed in the presence of humans, and the turtle does not differentiate between a shark and a diver when confined and surprised. The physical consequences of these collisions can be severe even without malicious intent. Dislocated shoulders and elbows occur when flippers strike extended arms, while impacts to the chest can knock the breath out of a diver, increasing panic and risk of uncontrolled ascent. Head impacts against rock or coral are particularly dangerous, especially in overhead environments where escape routes are limited. These injuries are compounded by the setting because caves and swim-throughs restrict movement and delay assistance, turning a brief encounter into a cascading emergency. From the turtle's perspective, these moments are equally dangerous, because collisions with hard surfaces or frantic movement in confined spaces can result in shell damage or entanglement. A panicked turtle may wedge itself deeper into a crevice, scraping shell edges against rock or striking coral structures that cause injury. This mutual risk highlights how shared spaces become hazardous, not because of aggression, but because of incompatible expectations and limited room for error. Ecologically, green sea turtles play a critical role in maintaining healthy seagrass beds and reef systems, grazing in ways that promote new growth and prevent overdominance by any single species. Their resting behavior in shallow areas is a natural extension of this lifestyle, placing them in precisely the zones humans favor for recreation. As coastal tourism increases and reef access expands, these overlaps become more frequent, raising the likelihood of accidental encounters that neither party intends. The danger lies not in turtles seeking interaction, but in humans failing to recognize how space functions differently for large, air-breathing reptiles underwater. Unlike fish, turtles cannot simply slip past obstacles without consequence, and unlike mammals, they do not vocalize or signal distress in ways humans intuitively understand. Their warning signs are subtle, often limited to slight shifts in posture or flipper tension that go unnoticed until movement becomes explosive. One of the most underestimated risks occurs when divers attempt to photograph turtles in caves or under ledges, positioning themselves between the turtle and open water for a better angle. This blocks the turtle's escape path, increasing stress and guaranteeing a forceful response once tolerance is exceeded. The turtle does not attack the obstruction, but moves through it, using the only means available, which is raw physical force applied without discrimination. Understanding turtle behavior in these contexts requires reframing them not as gentle ornaments of the reef, but as large, powerful animals adapted for survival over millions of years. Their peaceful appearance masks a body built for endurance, migration, and decisive escape. And their shell is not a shield that absorbs force, but a rigid structure that transfers it outward. In narrow spaces, this design becomes hazardous to anything sharing the same volume of water. The irony of turtle-related injuries is that they often occur in moments meant to be serene, during encounters people describe as magical or calming. The emotional dissonance makes these incidents particularly memorable because they violate deeply held assumptions about what constitutes danger in the ocean. A creature associated with calm becomes the source of injury, not through malice, but through instinct, reminding us that perception does not override biology. From a safety perspective, the lesson is not to fear turtles, but to respect space and behavior. Observing from a distance, avoiding blocking exits, and refraining from entering confined spaces occupied by resting turtles align human behavior with the animal's needs and reduce risk for both. These practices also protect turtles from stress and injury, supporting conservation efforts that depend on minimizing negative human interactions. In broader ecological terms, green sea turtles embody the challenge of coexisting with large wildlife in shared habitats. Their survival depends on access to shallow resting areas, and human enjoyment of reefs depends on the same spaces. Managing this overlap requires awareness and restraint rather than avoidance, recognizing that the reef is not designed around human comfort, but around the needs of species that have occupied it far longer. As this chapter closes the series, the green sea turtle serves as a reminder that danger in marine environments does not always advertise itself through teeth, venom, or speed. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in familiarity and calm, carried by animals we trust and underestimate. A heavy shell and powerful flippers become hazardous only when expectations collide, turning peaceful encounters into moments of impact. In the end, turtles do not seek to harm, and they do not defend territory aggressively, but they will always prioritize escape over human assumptions. In narrow swim-throughs and under ledges, where space compresses and surprise magnifies instinct, their movements carry weight that water cannot soften. The reef remains unchanged after such encounters. The turtle swims on, and the lesson lingers with those who experienced it, etched not in fear, but in bruises and memory. The ocean does not distinguish between gentle and dangerous in the ways humans do. And in that truth, the green sea turtle completes the story, reminding us that even the calmest giants can collide hard when startled in a world of stone and sand.